I spent nearly a decade underground. The work was hard and dangerous, but could be rewarding and very well compensated. Coal mining is a way of life here. Entire families have worked the mines. I myself have several family members who have retired or work down there still. I got out, not because of these experiences, but because I believe coal mining will end soon. There are other reasons, but I don't want to identify myself. Now, I'm no superstitious backwoods hillbilly who attributed every little thing as paranormal. I have a science and engineering background. Most things have reasonable explanations for the things we see. These stories of mine, or those that were told to me, are not the case. They have no explanation. The first time I heard of anything going bump in the dark was relayed by a co-worker. I was still a red hat at the time. For those who don't know, for the first 6 months to a year, depending on state law, a new miner must wear a red hard hat. They cannot leave sight or sound of the black hat they are assigned to. I was working with a guy about my age, who was a no-nonsense guy when it came to work. He was an extremely competent coal miner. We were working with a bolting machine when I looked over at the rib, the wall, and clearly written on the rib supports was the word ghost, followed by the time and date, which was a few weeks prior. Curious, I asked about the writing. He gave me a sheepish look and relayed this story to me. I was working down here off by myself, running the bolter. It was nearing the end of the shift, and I was keeping an eye for the relief crew to arrive on section. I just happened to look across the bolter and see a man standing there, looking at me. I was just about to say something when I realized that this guy was certainly not on our crew. Then I realized his cap light was emitting no light, and was in fact an old carbide lamp, not our battery-powered ones. My adrenaline spiked, and all I wanted to do was run away, but I was rooted to the spot. Looking at him, looking at me, he was about 5 feet away, standing behind the bolting machine, so just visible from the chest area up. Just as I was about to open my mouth to speak, or scream, I'm not sure, he turned 90 degrees and began walking along the side of the bolter. What's even strange is with every step he took, he would sink lower and lower into the ground, until his head was below the edge of the bolting machine. Picture the stairway gag if you know what I mean. I snapped out of it and ran around the other side of the machine to see no one there. He was gone, seemingly sank into the earth with each step. It was just our crew. I wrote the time and date on the support to help recall where and when I saw this. I returned to the spot that many times, hoping to see him again. I never did. I've seen these figures many times in several different mines. They're creepy as hell, and I dislike them immensely. My first encounter was just after I had gotten my black hat, allowing me free access to the entire mine. I was still wet behind the ears, however, and given a job that was essentially a babysitting gig. Go me. The job entailed watching over a machine called a booster drive. It was a machine that was placed along the belt that transported the coal out of the mine on a long wall section. Its whole job was to keep the belt moving and the river of coal moving out of the mine to the process facility. It's usually a cake gig if the beltman did their job correctly. I shovel up any spilled coal and call in the cavalry if shit goes sideways. Now, unlike 95% of the rest of the time, the booster drives had lighting installed. The light would spill up the entryway only so far, however. Beyond that point, it was the same inky black nothingness I've described before. I'd been there for a few days already and kept catching movement out of the corners of my eye. I grew up shooting and hunting, so unnatural movement catches my attention pretty rapidly. It would always disappear when I tried to look directly at it. Thing is, I would feel frightened, and definitely threatened when I would catch fleeting glances of it. It felt ominous. One day, after a pretty active day of jerking my head at the blackness and seeing movement, always retreating into the dark, I got angry and foolish. I called out, "I see you!" Whatever it was took 2 full strides into the light. It was shaped like a man, same size, height, and shape. Only it was completely black, a complete absence of light, but it had dimension, a thickness, full and thick like a person. I was so scared I got tunnel vision, and it seemed like all of the machinery went silent. I know it didn't, because the belts were still chugging away. It stood there for about 5 full seconds, did an about face and walked away into the dark. I stood staring at the spots for a good 20 seconds afterward, until my vision cleared and the steady roar of the booster filled my ears again. My head stayed on a swivel the rest of the shift. When I was relieved, I asked the man who took my place on the next shift, you ever see anything moving down there?" He took a long look at me and replied, "Yes." I asked, "What the hell is it?" He said, "I'm not sure I want to know. I wish I could say I never saw it again." That thing scared the shit out of me. This story concerns another encounter with this awful thing. I was working the same supposed cakewalk gig at the same booster location. This thing was discussed between the man and I relieved, myself, and the man who relieved me. We were all generally terrified of it. Some days we would notice it hanging around just out of the light, making 10-hour shifts seem like an eternity of looking over our shoulders. Other days, it would be completely absent. The days it was absent weren't exactly the best either. It was almost as bad wondering where that fucking thing was than actually seeing it out there pacing, flitting about, or worse, just watching us in our peripheral vision in the bare edge of the light. The shift I was on started like any other. I attempted to mentally prep myself for another day of shoveling spilled coal while having the shit scared out of me for the next 10 hours or so. After riding the man trip into the booster, I spoke to the stressed out, scared man I was relieving. I told him about the weather topside as we were expecting snow by the time we got outside. He told me it had been a quiet day and he hadn't seen any glimpses of our shadowy visitor. We bullshit for a bit while he waited for the man trip that would be his ride out of the mine. Eventually, it arrived, and he wished me luck while I told him to have a safe drive home. I was watching the belts cruise along, transporting all that black rock out of the mine, when suddenly, all of the power kicked off. My work area was instantly plunged into the pitch blackness, and the dull roar of the machinery coasted to a stop. The sudden change from bright light and noise to quiet blackness was unnerving. I turned on my cap light and made my way to the power center that controls the juice to check if the power kicked locally or if it was more widespread across the mine. I found all my breakers still set, meaning the outage was more than my booster. I got on my radio and confirmed the situation with the power was mine-wide. I made a seat with some bags of rock dust and leaned against the airlock wall to settle in for a bit. It was at this point I heard it. Footsteps. There were footsteps walking toward me, but no one was there. I was hoping upon hope I would not see that black human-shaped mass out there in the dark. They were heavy footfalls, like the sound of a huge man in work boots. This was bad enough hearing something walking around near me in the dark that I couldn't see. But sometimes the footsteps would increase from a slow walk to a run to a sprint, to footsteps so rapid no human could possibly make them. I felt like I was losing my sanity. I can't possibly describe how incredibly frightened I was. Suddenly, the lights and power kicked on without warning. It was standing 10 feet away from me. I screamed at it to leave me alone, and it turned around and walked away into the darkness. I damn near passed out from the shock and fear of it. If I hadn't been sitting on those dust bags, and convinced my knees would have buckled from under me. Once I had calmed down some, I realised I'd actually pissed myself a little. Embarrassing to admit, I know. If I hadn't urinated so recently, I have no doubt I would have soaked my trousers. I fucking hate that thing. I'm sorry to report that a 21-year-old miner was killed on a belt line on the 23rd of December at my former mine. If you could pray for his family, or at least send some positive vibes towards his family, it would be appreciated. This incident was quite different from my encounter with the shadowy visitor. This encounter was also unique because I had a co-worker directly beside me who also confirmed everything I saw. My co-worker I'll refer to as Luke from here out. Luke was an extremely intelligent former military man with a razor-sharp wit. Guy was downright hilarious, and I always enjoyed working with him. Like many other guys I've had the privilege of working with, Luke was hardworking, honest, and he took his commitment to work and family seriously. We were doing something called a power move in an active coal mining section. To the non-mining folk out there, I'll try to elaborate. Imagine that you're vacuuming your carpet. It's a large room, and your power cable can't reach all the way to the other side of the room, so you grab an extension cord to finish the carpet. When coal mining, almost all of the equipment is ran on high voltage. The machines have a heavy cable that powers it and connects to a large metal box called a load center or power center. A giant cable runs into the section, called a high line, to the load center, and then all of the machines are plugged into the load center with a giant power strip. It supplies over 12,000 volts to the section, and I don't even remember how many amps. Enough to blow softball-sized holes out of the unlucky soul who makes a giant mistake and touches something they shouldn't. After removing all of the coal that the machines can reach with the supplied cable, we add a length of cable to the high line, move the load center further into the section, and then the machines can now reach fresh coal to mine. During a power move, more beltline is added to allow transport of the mined coal, and walls have to be built to control the ventilation within the mining section. Then the cycle repeats. This occurs in what is called a gate section, while longwall section is a different cycle. I didn't intend for this to be a lesson in coal mining, but I digress. Luke and I were tapped to the building walls to control ventilation. It's a crappy way to spend the shift, but ventilation is crucial in a coal mine. We had the block in place, and now we were required to apply the sealant that is called mud. It's a dry powder that comes in bags that must be mixed with water to make a brown, thick liquid that can be spread over the surface of the block and fill in any gaps in the wall to make as close to an airtight seal as possible. It's messy, stinky, fibrous stuff that's dangerous to breathe, causes chemical burns to bare skin, ruins clothes, and has to be shoved and spread into every nook and cranny in a block wall that's fitted into uneven floor, walls, and roof. The block was somewhere around 45 pounds a pop, and you had to use quite a bit of it. Area was 16 feet wide and about 10 feet high. It was a pain in the ass. Gosh, sorry for the long lead-in. Luke and I had humped all of the block in place from the pallets, and it was mud time. Problem was that the beltman had our water supply cut off to extend the water lines. Our boss told us that we were not permitted to leave the mine until the wall was finished. Without proper ventilation, coal couldn't be mined. Coal pays our wage. Coal pays the bills. Problem is, no water, no mud, no wall. The beltman wouldn't have the water ready until the relief shift had arrived. Different bosses, different orders. During the shift, I had noticed large pools of water had collected in the return entry. I told Luke that I knew where usable water was, and we could grab some buckets and collect water there to mix the mud. We needed water, but didn't have to be clean water. We were kneeling down collecting water from a large puddle. when I saw a miner walking towards us. It was later in the shift, so I assumed it was the fire boss on his inspection. Luke saw him as well. I noticed his cap light was unusually dim. It happens. Most miners carry a backup cap light for this contingency, since batteries wear out over the lifetime. I distinctly remember his reflective clothing we were all required to wear. He was walking towards us as we were looking down, filling our buckets with water. When I looked back up, he was completely gone. Vanished into thin air. I half yelled to Luke, "Where the fuck did he go?" I recall him looking all around us, realizing that there was literally nowhere for him to escape to. Then looking back at me. He opened and closed his mouth a few times as if to offer an explanation and realized there wasn't any. Gone. We finished the war somewhat later that shift, and this experience became a talking point between us. After discussing several things we had seen, it became apparent to me that he had experienced the shadow entity I had, only not as closely. And I had met another person who I could confide in what I was seeing without being ridiculed. Some men worked entire underground careers without experiencing anything unexplainable. Others, like myself, Luke, and others, saw things that shook men to the core. I ran into a former co-worker at a local store today, and it jogged my memory of an encounter a co-worker had in the mine. I'll refer to my co-worker as Jake from here out. I spoke with Jake about his encounter a day or two after it had happened, and he was definitely spooked by what he had seen. It was very unlike Jake to be flustered by anything really, as the man is built like a tank. You all know the type. Athletic, weightlifter, good with the ladies, and irritatingly good at anything they attempt. In a coal mine, inspections take place several times a day in operating sections, as well as areas that have been dormant for a long time. These guys are known as a fire boss. Firebossing is serious business, as the lives of many men rest on them doing their job correctly. Mostly, they are checking for roof falls, rib rolls, hot rollers on the beltline, correct and adequate airflow, and the scourge of all coal miners, methane. It was during a fireboss run that Jake had this encounter. I was on my runs signing the date boards and had to pass through a regulator, an airlock. I opened the first door of the dog box, got in and closed the door. As soon as I closed the door, I heard the latch of the other door behind me get thrown really hard. I felt the air pressure change as the other door was opened. I turned around surprised since I wasn't expecting anywhere else way up here, and it was looking at me. I asked what was looking at you. I don't know what it was. It was completely hairless, like no hair, eyebrows, or facial hair. It was a white or greyish colour, and I didn't see any colour in its eyes. It had this awful look on its face, like it was going to rip me up and enjoy itself doing it. I threw the other door open against the air pressure and ran. I'll tell you, just as I already told Donnie, our mine foreman, that I ain't ever going back up there. They can fire me first. I felt bad for Jake. He got in some trouble because he flat refused to finish the fire boss run that day. Another man had to make his way in and do it before the mine could be cleared for the next shift. Rumour is, the man who finished the fire boss run took a gun with him. It's a federal crime to take a gun underground, but if whatever it was had scared Big Jake, I can hardly fault the man. I had honestly never planned to write them at all, really. Most of the people involved never even talked about the unexplained things they had seen or heard in that place, or were very reluctant to. Perhaps it has to do with the trust coal miners have with one another. While I was in, I know the possibility that a methane build-up and explosion is a very real thing. It's happened numerous times in the past. Yet, I trust the fire bosses have done their runs correctly to monitor the gas. I trust the rock dusting crew is suppressing explosive coal dust. I trust the man running the multiple-ton piece of equipment I have to work in close proximity with doesn't inadvertently crush me between a rock and a hard place. I trust my own skills when operating a roof bolter. If a man you're trusting your life with in a very dangerous location begins telling stories of shadow people walking around, phantom miners, disembodied lights, and a white humanoid figure I was informed was likely a crawler, how do you process that? How do you deal if you are someone seeing and experiencing them? Hey John, yeah, I got all the hay put up. Tractor gave me some trouble though. I did see a few good books around that I will be watching for this season. By the way, I saw a shadow person skulking around the feeder and beltline in 18 West. Might want to keep an eye out if it wants to drag you to hell, or follow you home to your family. Want to help load up the scoop? No worries, I won't accidentally crush the light out of you, trust me. This encounter is, by far, the one that was witnessed by the most people at once. The people who were involved consisted of mostly bosses, and men higher up in the pecking order of the mine. The encounter occurred during a visit by bosses and coordinators of the mine, just before the start of a major operation called a longwall move. It involves dismantling $100 million in equipment from a completed longwall section, transporting the equipment to a fresh longwall panel a couple years in the making, and putting it all back together. This is no small feat. This operation is an all hands on deck, highly coordinated, very labour-intensive operation, with gobs of heavy equipment and people in motion. Coordinators and longwall bosses have been known to sleep, eat, essentially live at the portal until it's finished. To the encounter. It was Sunday afternoon. Countdown to kick off the midnight shift that was actually Monday morning. To the non-mining folks out there, a coal mine on a Sunday afternoon is essentially empty. Fire bosses do their runs, some contractors may be doing some out-by work, but generally speaking, mining sections are empty of miners. A man trip loaded with bosses and coordinators travel about 45 minutes on rail from the elevator bottom to the longwall panel, about to be loaded with millions in equipment used in the extraction of countless tons of that black rock. Upon arrival at that section, the men take their gear to what will soon be the dinner hall to put down their lunch buckets, coats, tools, gear, etc. After putting down their gear, they begin to move about the section talking shop concerning equipment locations, timetables, equipment operators to use, normal pre-operation talk. One of the bosses sees a figure walk from a crosscut. He points out the figure to the present party. The figure strolls out of the crosscut wearing a dim headlamp across what will be an equipment location, and into the longwall face, disappearing into the rock wall. The men are dumbfounded. They essentially run to the location, simultaneously calling dispatch on the radio, inquiring who else was up there, and the tracking information on all the parties present. Tracking station reports they're the only people there, and no dispatcher has sent anyone into section in many hours. The present crew scoured the section, looking for the figure most of them saw. After looking around, one of the bosses radioed the others to return to the dinner hall. All of the contents of their lunch pails, tools, jackets were upended and thrown about the location. It was like a 10-year-old on a temper tantrum was allowed to unleash his fury. The men, probably unnerved as they were, cleaned up and continued the task at hand. The longwall move started on time and completed pretty close to on schedule. The few that would talk about it afterwards were definitely shaken. Their radio chatter from that night were of scared men trying to stay calm and do their job. And they did. Yesterday, I froze my ass off. Fortunately, I'm not in Texas, and those areas struggling with no water, power, and thousands of dollars of electric bills, which I struggled to wrap my head around. My home was without power for around 7 hours yesterday. And with the piles of snow hanging around here in West Virginia, the temperature in my home was far more comfortable. While hanging out and reading my book, my mind began to wander back to some of those strange experiences I had while working in the mine. I think the cold helped to bring back the memory because that shift, among many others, was frigid. A common misconception people have is that the mine remains a constant temperature. This isn't true. Admittedly, during the summer months, the mine is somewhat cooler, as we're underground and not subjected to the direct solar radiation that serves to make the days so hot. This doesn't mean that men are comfortable during the summer months. The thing most people fail to realize is that coal mines are pumped full of air year-round. Air measured in several thousand cubic feet per minute is required, by law, to course through that mine to provide ventilation. That means during the hottest summer months, hot and humid air is being forced underground into the workspace. The humidity gets so bad sometimes, condensation drips from everything. Add hot equipment, and I've literally witnessed men wring sweat from shirts. Conversely, this airflow tends to make the mine a very cold and bleak place during the winter months. Men working day shift arrive to the mine and cage down when the sun is mostly still below the horizon. They then work their shift in complete darkness and cage up when the sun is mostly set. The result is a man on day shift not getting to see the sun for a week or more. A man on midnight shift spends his work during the coldest hours of the day, pummeled by frigid air. When a miner doing heavy work sweats on any shift, that frigid air chills to the bone. Imagine your clothes being wet in December, then riding in the bed of a truck. I don't recall what shift I was working during this encounter. I do recall that my area was experiencing what was called a polar vortex. It didn't matter how many layers you wore, it was just so cold. I was working with a guy I'd been paired up with several times in the past. We had the same job bid, so it wasn't unusual for us to work together since we had the same job classification. We were working for a bit, then ducking into an area out of the direct airflow to try and stay warm. Several times while we were working together, I observed him stopping what he was doing and looking up the mine entry. I ignored this for some time as my only concerns at that moment were something like, holy shit cold, holy shit cold, holy shit cold, fuck me it's cold. Eventually, I had enough of him staring off up the entry and asked what the hell was the problem. He said, "Have you noticed the light?" I replied that I hadn't. We stepped out of the direct airflow and he told me that for the last hour or so, he'd seen a dim light moving back and forth up the entry. This was before my encounters with that, whatever it was, later in my career. I told him that it was likely our own cap lights he was seeing, and no one else was up there. We had to take a man trip and then walk quite a while just to get to our work area, and were far enough in that working alone was greatly discouraged. He then looked at me and said something that greatly disarmed me. He said, "I'm sure." We made a couple of seats on the mine floor, sat down and shut off our cap lights. For a minute or so, my brain tried to fill in the blackness and sensory deprivation from the complete lack of sight. Following that, my brain seemed to be okay, that I was sitting in the pitch black. We sat this way for probably 10 to 20 minutes. Time was hard to judge then. We sat completely silent when I began to see a dim light from a crosscut up the entry. The light got brighter until I could see a single point of dim light about the height of a man bobbing slowly along like the gait of a person walking casually. It crossed the entry and disappeared into the crosscut on the other side. I never saw anything but the dim light bobbing along, as if someone was slowly strolling about. At first, I wondered if it was my mind just filling in the sensory deprivation. However, at the moment the light broke the crosscuts and into the entryway, I heard my co-worker's intake of breath as he was processing what he was seeing. The light nearly faded from view as it entered the opposite crosscut, but stayed a dim glow. The light began to go brighter again as it emerged in the entry, to cross back to where it started. The light was a little dimmer on the return trip, but there's no mistaking it was there. We sat this way for another 30 or so minutes. Again, time was very hard to judge. The light seemed to mill around on the left side of the entry in the crosscuts out of the direct line of sight, until the area returned to pitch dark again. I struggled to estimate the amount of time light could be observed. After we got enough courage to speak to one another, we compared stories to be sure we observed the same thing. After our shift ended, 2 guys on the next shift were to travel up to where we were to continue roof bolting. If it wasn't done, to the next shift until completion. The job was completed before we had to return to the area the next day. So I think I'm going insane, but I don't know. I watched The Conjuring 3 2 nights ago, and the little odd happenings around my apartment have gotten worse. Last night, I was reaching for a pen on top of my mini fridge, and it fell onto the floor. I got up and didn't see it, and looked all around. I even looked under it and cleared the top of it because I literally touched it with my hand, so it had to have been there, right? It freaked me out and stressed me out, so I walked out of the living room and came back in and saw it on my desk. I was literally in shock. My boyfriend knew I was looking for it and said I probably put it there and forgot. It's definitely possible, but I doubt it. It was a very distinct houndstooth pen. It was like someone was just playing a joke on me. Today, when my boyfriend left the room and went to the bathroom, my TV just randomly turned off, but the sound kept playing. My boyfriend told me to chill, nothing is there. Before these incidents, there were weird things that happened on occasion that would be brushed off by me. One time, this foul sulfur odour filled the apartment, and we literally ran to the one corner of the apartment that the smell didn't hit. It was so weird, but by the front door, the smell wasn't as strong. My boyfriend thought it was a demon, and I thought it was a gas leak. I called emergency maintenance to check our hot water heater, and everything was fine. Right after the smell cleared out, my boyfriend and I heard a noise that sounded like an animal breathing or growling. Our neighbours upstairs have dogs, but they make very distinct noises, and this was not a domesticated pet. We both heard it, and we couldn't explain it. Also, while getting ready in the bathroom, I always see something in the mirror moving. If I looked into the mirror in my bathroom with the door open and looked into the living room, I could see something move, and it wasn't me or my boyfriend. I just feel like I'm being watched and played around with. I just need opinions, please. Feel like I'm going crazy. I can usually explain everything away, but these weird things and the extreme coldness is scaring the shit out of me, and it takes a lot to scare me. Around the ages of 8 to 9, I lived in a little trailer with my abusive family. We had a large backyard that was part field and open to the woods. It was in rural Georgia. During this time, I had some strange occurrences happen to me that today I still can't explain. Since it's been so many years, my memory is hazy on some of it, but I remember distinct patterns. I remember when we first moved there, I was terribly afraid to be alone outdoors in our backyard. As soon as I noticed I was alone and my parents had gone back inside for their smoke break, I'd run to the front yard and then return when I heard them talking on the back porch. For some reason, I felt like I was being heavily watched, and I would be filled with a sense of dread. I thought I'd hear footsteps in the woods, but I would be told by my parents that it was just birds or deer. Several years later, my mother informed me that I told her once that there was an older man outside walking by our road, but when she looked, there wasn't anyone around. I had apparently seen this from my bedroom window that looked out to the front yard and road. I also used to sleep terribly. For several months, I'd wake up around 3 a.m. without any explanation. I used to brush it off and just go back to sleep, and just thought it was weird it was always the same time. And then I started feeling the strangest thing. As I was falling asleep at night, I'd feel my body lift from the bed. As soon as I dozed back into reality, it felt like I was let go and back onto the mattress. I'd shrugged this off as some hallucination caused by partial sleep, if it weren't for the fact one time I distinctly remember waking up and feeling myself bounce onto the mattress and hearing the bed springs. It was horrifying. Even now I don't want to believe it, and will try to come up with other answers to the mystery. I even had a nightmare once about a shadowed man, and I couldn't see his face or clothes, except that he wore a large brimmed hat and oversized boots. The scariest thing that's ever happened to me, though, I still can't find an explanation for. I find only relief that as years pass and the memory gets fuzzier, I can try to convince myself it was all a dream. I woke up at around 3 a.m. again, and this time I heard a voice. There was a deep, buzzing hum that sounded at intervals. It's hard to describe as anything that doesn't sound cartoonish, but I was horrified. It sounded like it was right outside my bedroom windows. And then, after that quieted, I heard another noise. This is going to sound ridiculous, but I can only describe it as a gargling, clicking noise. Like if a squirrel decided to imitate Perry the platypus. And it sounded like there was more than one, and it was somewhere in my room. I couldn't tell if it was right by my door or behind my back, watching me and communicating with each other. I was so afraid I kept my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep and didn't move. I didn't know if it was aliens or a haunting, or an aliens with a haunting, but I couldn't go back to sleep for a while after that. I didn't move for at least another hour, and I didn't tell a soul for years. It was shortly thereafter I had a little breakdown. I tried to talk to my stepdad about the happenings once, but he disregarded it and kept telling me that ghosts weren't real and that I was dreaming. One night, all the paranoia and fear peaked, and I remember sitting in bed crying before I had to sleep, and begging with whatever thing was messing with me to leave me alone. Oddly enough, everything stopped after that. I can't recall any more paranormal occurrences that may have happened. After my mother got custody of my little brother and we could play outside together, I stopped feeling the dread too. I was in med school, which had a very old hospital. There were rumours that the well that was in an abandoned part of campus was haunted. I also heard that on certain days we could hear the spirits talking in the well. On inquiring, I found out that during the 1990s, there was an endemic of tuberculosis in that region. Relatives left the bodies of the deceased dead ones in hospital. Due to low-quality disposal facility, the bodies were disposed in the well. After a few days of disposal, there were loud growling sounds heard by people in the waiting area between the hospital and the well at night. For this purpose, a holy place/temple was built with the idol of God to balance the forces. A special ritual is performed at full moon night, as it was believed that God is much more powerful during that night. Thus, the ritual would just maintain that dominance of power of God. The only exception would be no moon night, during which the evil entities become dominant. On that night, we could hear them talking in the well. I didn't believe it as such. Fast forward to the present, it was the last day of med school. That night was the no moon night. We friends partied hard at night and got wasted. After that, at about 2 o'clock, one of my arsehole friends had an idea of listening to the spirits talk, so we went there. On reaching, we listened to some mumbling from the well. On reaching there, we literally heard, "Shh, the smell of earthly pleasure." Shit, we forgot that strong smell of whiskey was coming from us. The asshole friend asked, "Who are you?" Mistake. We heard the words, Why don't you join us below? We'll talk. That moment, whiskey level of blood dropped to 0. That asshole then decided to pull a stunt. He had flowers which were blessed by the temple. He deliberately threw them in the well and yelled, "Fuck you!" Then we heard the most unnerving demonic scream of our life. We ran for our life. We also heard the watchman running to the well from the other side after listening to the scream. We ran to our rooms and couldn't sleep. On the next day, administration said that one watchman committed suicide in the well. I knew that wasn't suicide. We friends looked at each other, hugged and cried. One innocent person lost his life due to our foolish seek for thrill. Couldn't wipe that blood on our hands. May God mercy on all. I was 15 years old at the time, and my best friend and I were on the trampoline. We had been bouncing around, having ourselves a good time, like usual, and we were tuckered out after a couple of minutes. My parents were more strict than his, and didn't allow me to have a phone until I was older. This girl he liked had texted him, and he was replying to her on the trampoline, looking down. Approximately 40 feet above my neighbour's house, yes, like seriously close, hovered a UFO. It made no sound and moved about 20 miles an hour. It went over his roof and across the lake in front of my neighbour's house, across the highway, and then basically disappeared out of view. This is what it looked like. 7 balls of light, all about 10 feet from each other, in the shape of a triangle with nothing connecting them. The light I would describe as incandescent or more similar to the sun, not like an LED. Even ones that are meant to look incandescent, you can tell usually. It was a very rich, bright, warm light. It was extremely bright in the sense that it was light enough to shine in daylight, but didn't cast extra light onto me or my friend, or the trampoline. It seemed to travel basically straight, but going up at an angle by the time it went across the highway. It was over 200, maybe 400 feet in the air. It seemed to just slip away into the horizon. I was so utterly dumbfounded, I made no sound either and didn't alert my friend until the last moment. And by the time it was slipping away into the horizon, this is my biggest regret in life. He was right there. Do I personally believe it was aliens? I'm not sure. I have no clue, but I'm not making it up. And I think if it made even the slightest sound, I would probably have spoken up. But it was so silent, it was just there and gone. This happened about 10 years ago. I was about 20 years old, dating this guy from California. We lived in South Carolina at the time. He'd only lived in South Carolina a few months, so he wasn't familiar with the area. He had a job traveling to repair point-of-sale systems and retail stores. Because he grew up in Southern California, he really loved finding long country roads and just exploring the rural areas of South Carolina. It was pretty common for him to come home and pick me up, for us to go explore some new road he'd travelled for work. We lived in a very small town, and I looked forward to these adventures, just to get out of town. One summer night, we decided to go for a drive down one of his roads and towards Dillon. It's a typical summer night in the south. Clear skies and the air is thick and sticky, like after you take a long hot shower. We've been driving down this 2-lane country road for a few miles, deep in the middle of a southern pine forest. We pass a small church on the right and come out of the woods to an open field, where the road curves towards the right. In the curve, there's a dirt road on the left-hand side. My boyfriend decides this is a good spot to stop and have a smoke. He backs his truck into the dirt road so that the front end is facing across the main road into an open field. I can see behind us from the tail lights, there's a big gate blocking off the dirt road with a sign that says Rifle Club. Before he gets out of the truck, he leans over to give me a kiss, which turns into a longer kiss. I mean, We're on the side of the road in the dark. Why not? As we're kissing, I can't explain it. I felt like I was being watched, so I opened my eyes mid-kiss and looked out the front. Apparently, I stopped being as attentive to the kiss because he stopped and turned, asking what was wrong. I saw a flickering light ahead of us across the street in the field. At first, I suspected it was a light off of a radio tower or something. But as we watched, the light appeared to move. Sort of swayed a bit like someone was walking holding the light. Our first thoughts were that we had parked near some old farm we couldn't see, and the farmer was coming to chase us off. There was no fear, just sort of shock and curiosity as we watched. It was weird because it seemed to be moving closer to us, but at the same time, it still kind of looked like it was far away in the distance. While watching, I could also see the lights from the dash of the truck reflecting off the windshield, so I thought maybe it was a reflection. We rolled the windows down and stuck our head out of the truck and could still see the light. The light kept coming towards us until it got to about 15 feet away from the other side of the road. It stopped and went back the way it came. As soon as the light disappeared, we both felt the urgent need to leave. We took off the way we came, going back by the church and out towards the main highway. As we turn onto the main road, I see a sign that says to turn right to go to Bingham. That's when it hit me. That's when I knew exactly where we were and what we saw. As a child growing up in the area, there were many urban legends, Bingham's light being one of them. I never truly believed it as a child. I thought it was just some old ghost story. We drove straight home that night and didn't go to sleep. The rest of the night we spent reading about Bingham's light and other encounters. As soon as the sun came up, we drove back out to the dirt road where we parked the night before. We walked out to the field and we saw the light looking for any evidence of what we saw, but there was nothing. It didn't make sense to me. I wasn't sure if it was Bingham's light because the stories all claim you see the light near railroad tracks. We decided to turn left of the dirt road and continue down the road the rest of the way just to see where it goes. Not even half a mile down the road, we cross what used to be railroad tracks. Still to this day, I'm unsure what we saw. Legend says a man back in the 1800s died on the railroad tracks. There's many different versions of the story, but that's the gist of it. Supposedly, if you go to the tracks, you can still see the light of his lantern. The show Unsolved Mysteries did an episode on Bingham's light and explained the light as just swamp gas. We drove that area the next day in daylight, and I don't recall ever seeing any swampland near to the area we spotted the light. I've thought about going back out there several times, but the idea terrifies me. Maybe one day I'll get the nerve to go back. When I was 6 years old, my grandfather died. I was his first grandchild, and I was the only grandchild he ever got to meet, sadly. I don't have many memories of him. The only ones I can remember are visiting him towards the end of his life in hospital. When I was about 10, my cousin was born, and he was born to my oldest uncle and his wife. A couple months after he was born, he was christened, and all of my family members went to the church. Midway through the ceremony, one of us spotted a huge brown and orange butterfly that had landed on the stained glass window of the church. Once one of us had seen it, we couldn't help but acknowledge its piercing presence. All of a sudden, the butterfly flew off the window and started moving towards my uncle and his newborn child. The butterfly landed on my uncle's shoulder, to which my uncle cracked a smile to, and then landed on my uncle's wife's head, messing up her hair. Then it sat on the edge of my cousin's crib and lingered for a couple of seconds. All my uncles and aunties exchanged glances and smirked to one another because they all knew who it was. It was my grandfather. The butterfly went back to the window where it stayed for the remainder of the church service. My grandmother said the way he messed up my uncle's wife's hair was exactly like my grandfather's humour, and the way he landed on my uncle's shoulder as if to gratify all of his hard work throughout the years and the start of his new family showed how much he appreciated his family. We still talk about the butterfly years later, seeking out every brown and orange butterfly to try and pin the evergreen presence of my grandfather on it. I'm not a religious person at all, but something about the butterfly makes me feel a strong sense of reassurance that our loved ones are still with us and are living on through small cracks of nature. All this UFO stuff that I've seen recently made me remember something that happened to me around 2 years ago. I honestly don't know what it was. I just moved this memory so far in my head that I forgot about it. I was riding my motorcycle coming home from a trip. I took a shortcut via a forest and a heap from the mine, like all the extra material they got from mining coal, and then put it all in one pile. I rode this road more than 1,000 times before on my bicycle, my motorcycle, and sometimes when I just made a barbecue with my friends on the heap. It was around 9 or 10 p.m. I don't remember, but it was already dark, but not so much that I needed headlights to see, but I kept them on anyways. I was already on the upper side of the heap. Then my phone and my Garmin that I had mounted on my handlebars turned off, literally in an instant. Like somebody would just cut the battery wires to them. And my intercom and my helmet that I used to listen to the radio also turned off. Even my speedometer. I had fancy electronic aftermarket one put on. It turned off, just like somebody had cut the power lines. My motorcycle started to feel wired like gas. Was ending it. Was popping. I had very little power, but was still running. I remember that tank was not full, but not empty, but it still acted weird. Then there was light. Not much, but something like a Jeep or something that turned on their extra light bar right behind me. At that moment, I was literally shitting and pissing myself. I was so scared that somebody would come kill me or rape me or do something worse. I just kind of twisted the throttle open to the max and rode around 60-degree slope right into the denser part of the heap that was filled with trees and bushes. To be honest, I don't really remember the rest of my trip home. I remember that I smashed my mirror and cut my hand over a tree branch and rode so hard that when I got home, the oil was so hot that the dipstick thermometer was off the scale and oil got really, really black. To this day, I don't know what the hell was that. Maybe this wall all of a coincidence and someone was just staring up their Jeep on the heap, since sometimes there are off-road enthusiasts riding their cars there. So me and my friend TJ back in 2018 used to do a lot of cryptic ghost hunting, and especially because where we're from, there's a lot of stories of areas with crazy history. An example is the woods a block from my house that has stone steps in the middle of it, completely out of the way of everything. Basically, long story short, the stairs were from a church that burnt down long ago. And rumour has it, people died in that fire, and that's why the woods are now haunted. Me and my friend B saw some shit in those woods too. But with this image in your head, now you can understand that the area has a lot of paranormal activity. Now, back to the main story. Me and TJ one night found out the Conjuring house, Buryville. It's like a 20-minute drive from us, so we decided to check it out. It was about 2 a.m. when we started driving there, and a lot of weird shit started to happen when we got to the first road on the way to the house. For a reference to how creepy this area was, It was practically out in the middle of the sticks, barely any streetlights. And lastly, the energy was the strangest. It felt like we were being watched all the way to the house. When the GPS said about 3 minutes away from the house, TJ's radio started glitching, repeating the chorus of R.I.P. by Joji. Chorus, me and you and I would die for you, do or die for you, suicide for you, R.I.P. I would die 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 for you, I would die for you, I would die for you, I would die for you. When it came on. Needless to say, that the vibe got a lot darker after that. And when we actually arrived, when we got there, not much happened until we were about to leave. The vibe was growing worse the longer we stayed. And then TJ heard something, so we left because the energy was something different. As we're leaving, the GPS quickly made us turn to a road different from the way we came. As soon as we were approaching the original entrance to the street of the Conjuring house. At the time, we didn't think much of it because we were just trying to leave the area because of the way it was making us feel. This road was a lot creepier than the others because of how it brought us directly into the middle of the woods. Even some parts weren't paved, if I'm remembering correctly, with really weird looking houses spaced apart. Well, as we're going down the road, I look down at my phone and in that second, TJ starts punching my arm, yelling, "Look up, bro, what the fuck?" And as I looked up, the strangest things I've ever seen in my life jumps across the road like 5 feet away from the car and into the woods at the speed of a fucking cheetah. To give you guys a better idea of what it looked like, first of all, it was as tall as a kangaroo, and I mean the tall ones. The thing had to be 7 feet. Second, it was jumping in medium-sized jumps. Not sure what the word for the movement is, but quick, how a gear works. That's how smooth and fast the thing's ledge touched the ground, propelled forward and repeated. Like in the 4 seconds it took to drive the car to where it was on the road, it was like hundreds of feet away into the woods. Lastly, the most amazing but strange thing about it was its actual appearance. It looked like moving energy. A bundle of trees moving together in the shape of this animal-looking thing, and its odd colours were crazy. It was a combination of neon brown, neon dark green, neon orange, and some other less noticeable colours that sort of filled in the rest of its shape as it was taken. As we drove by, we freaked out, of course, and talked about the whole thing the ride home to try to make sense of what we saw. We even tried to find the road we were on that night on 3 separate occasions. After that, to see if we could maybe see it again, but we were never told or found that road again. That night changed my life because I never thought I'd see something like that so close. But since then, I've been trying to find the answers. Hi, my name is Turtlebox1, and I'm camping in my living room on an inflatable mattress near my AC due to the PNW heat. I'm across from the hallway to the front door. My boyfriend left for late night food, and I'm headed to bed. Naturally, I'm scrolling Facebook when I see a white figure under the phone. As I'm holding it a bit up in the air and under it could see if someone came through the door. Assuming I was seeing things, I lowered my phone and said, "Honey, did you forget something?" and stared at the white figure. My cat got startled and ran to hide, and the figure turned and stepped towards the door. There's about a foot between the hallway and the door, so it was out of view. The door didn't open. I didn't hear the lock turn. Texted my boyfriend. He sent me a Snapchat message with a pic of the drive-thru he was sitting in, 10 minutes away from the apartment. We have no roommates. About a year and a half ago, my boyfriend and I were in a different apartment. I was playing video games on the bed, facing the same wall the door was on. He walks into the room in a neon yellow sweatshirt I know he doesn't own. I say, "One sec," as I get to a safe spot to pause and see what he needs, and he patiently stands there. Not out of the ordinary. I pause and look over. I'm transfixed on the sweatshirt before he turns to leave. About 1 second after he steps out of view, I hear the kitchen sink. It was too far away for him to feasibly have reached it so quickly. As I'm sitting there confused, I hear footsteps as he approaches and enters the room. Wearing normal clothes, I asked about the sweatshirt and he said he doesn't know what I'm talking about and that he wasn't in there. I insisted someone was and he questioned what they looked like. I can picture his body and head, but no face. I was focused on the sweatshirt. Before that, 2.5 years ago, we're sitting on my boyfriend's bed. I'm fairly religious, and he was just becoming so. I tell him something feels wrong and asked if we could pray together. He agrees, and I just froze. I felt something, sensed something dark there. With a hand on his shoulder. I freaked out, and later, after the fact, he was brushing his teeth shirtless and noticed 3 long scratches, fresh, down the back of his shoulder like claws. Now, I'm inclined, because of my religious upbringing, to think a demon at the oldest encounter. But I pretty much don't think labels are the best idea because I'm just scared. Something or some things are watching me. Does anyone know anything here? Does this sound familiar to you? This happened a while ago, but I'd really like to share it. It was about 10 years ago, my buddy and I were driving from New Jersey to Chicago. We were making the trip overnight as to avoid traffic. I honestly couldn't tell you exactly where we were, but it was somewhere in Pennsylvania. We were heading west, but not quite to Pittsburgh yet. It was like 2 or 3 in the morning. The sky is the clearest I've ever seen in my life. I felt like I could see every single star in the sky. There's nobody on the road with us, and we have nothing but trees on both sides of the road. Literally out of nowhere, a blue orb appeared. It wasn't very large, maybe the size of a car. It hovered in front of our car above the road. It was emitting very bright blue lights, which is why I'm just calling it a blue orb. It appeared out of nowhere and seemed to maintain a very precise distance in front of our car. It wasn't getting closer or farther. It did this for maybe 10 seconds, 5 seconds. I'm not sure. We were both asking each other what the fuck we were looking at. After that time, it shoots straight up extremely fast. And just like that, it was gone. I don't know if it was aliens. I don't know what the hell it was. I don't tell the story often because I sound so far-fetched. I just wanted to share it. I hope you guys enjoy it. This is 100% true. No drugs or anything like that. We both saw it. It's probably the only event in my life I cannot possibly think of an explanation. Okay, so I was a couple years out of high school. By this time, the house was kind of set up as a duplex, which meant I pretty much had the upstairs to myself. Now, we have no documentation of this, but the family generally believed the house was part of the Underground Railroad. The timeline and area lends itself to it, as well as the room dimensions that don't add up along with usually deep walls. So I was rearranging my books in a built-in bookcase. I shoved a book back, making a knock against the back wall, which to my surprise was responded to by a rapid knock knock, pause, slow, knock, knock. Call me a coward, but I decided to finish the books later and went to watch TV instead. Now the reason I used EVP flare was because around the same time I was having trouble sleeping, which was a strange thing in itself, but not really something I can easily put into words, or more compelling experience than simply saying strange dreams and feelings. So I ended up using this sleep app that was supposed to help you with sleep habits. Part of it was recording you sleep to help with identifying REM sleep. I quit using the app after a week when I started hearing voices whispering as I slept. Unfortunately, too quiet to really understand, other than to say there seemed to be at least 2, and maybe as many as 4 voices at certain points. Another experience, praying is a very private thing to me, more akin to meditation and self-reflection. That being said, I was in my room, eyes closed, praying, when someone began tugging at my arm. Now, family knew praying was very personal to me, so I was angry that they would intrude. So I ignored the tug and continued, only to have the tugging return more insistent. So I opened my eyes and whipped my head around and angrily asked, "What?" And of course, you all know, no one was there. I was completely alone in my room. The basement was really an old root cellar that had been dug out over the years. There were 3 rooms and what equated to little more than a crawl space that was never dug out under half the house. I'll mention in the crawl space there was a lot of trash and beer bottles, but disturbingly, also funeral vases, and yes, 2 that you could see, urns. Now, crazy or not, we never messed with them and left them alone. Didn't want to disturb things and make it worse. The back room and front room were okay. You could definitely feel something watching you, but the thing seemed confined to the middle room close to the opening of the crawl space. I have a super strange story about the basement that I'll save, for now. One of the few times I seriously scared, you got the feeling the thing in the basement wanted to hurt you. But to be honest, aside from a few small scratches, welts and bruises, you couldn't explain after being down there. It seemed to be limited in strength, I guess. And it was the basement and easy to avoid. The second was a woman we ended up calling the nanny. She actually seemed to be helpful. She would close windows in rainstorms before you even got to them, turned off burners on the stove and cover boiling pots. I saw her twice. My sister saw her a handful of times. She said she would catch the nanny sitting in the corner of her room, which would eventually be my bedroom and had a sealed off access to the old attic, out of her peripheral vision in the rocking chair that would rock slowly. As well as saying she would often wake up on cold nights to a woman pulling the covers up or even putting another blanket on the bed. Our mother would always confirm when this was or wasn't her the next morning, and often it wasn't her. Again, cliche I know, but when I saw her, she had a long brownish dress and pulled up hair. Very late 1800s, early turn of the century. We called her the nanny because she was very active around the house. She seemed the most centered in the back room upstairs, which over the years had been converted into a kitchen, a study, a storage room, and back into a kitchen. But that was originally when the house was built, the maid's quarters that connected to the children's rooms and had a back staircase to the downstairs kitchen. Lastly, and this is where I might lose some of you, was the cat. Quite simply, it was a cat. There's no other way to describe it. It seemed to be a small animal that acted like a cat would. Though my dad took years to admit it, more about that in later experiences if you all want, he would eventually tell us the cat would jump on him, and he could feel it as well as see his clothes and chair move as it laid on him. I personally saw the leather on chair shift and sink as some invisible thing jumped on the arm of the chair and climbed onto the back of it to rest behind his head. My oldest sister said she often felt it wrapping around her legs as she did dishes, only to look down and see nothing. One of the most interesting stories about the cat, my folks got a new large sectional couch. Only my sister, me, and my mom were home. We unpacked it and set it up. We sat there and lazily watched the cats playing in the packing it had come in. The paper and wrap and cardboard moving and shaking, when it suddenly occurred to me our cats were up. We had locked them in the bathroom before we started unpacking the couch to keep them out the way. I looked at my mom and said, "Wait, what's playing in the packing?" And again, she simply smirked and said, "Just picking up on that, huh?" I had seen the nanny twice. She was a woman seemingly in her 30s, long brownish dress that looked to me to be something from the late 1800s to the turn of the century, with her hair in a bun. The first time, I was probably 10 or 11. I woke up and noticed movement by the door. I rolled over and at first, I even thought it was Mom, until I woke up enough to notice the dress. I don't believe I ever saw my mom in a dress, even in pictures. I sat up, pretty startled, and frankly, ready to make a dash for the far door if I needed to. She milled about the door for a few seconds, which seemed to last forever. Then she just kind of stepped through it and was gone. Okay, and the reason I flared this one animal sensitivity is because of my dog. I was in my early 20s, one of the last few years I was in the house. My dog and I were alone in the house for the afternoon. Sitting in the living room, which opened in a big archway into the foyer, you could easily see through the arch to the front door and the stairs. My dog suddenly jumped up and stalked, you'll know when you see a dog stalk, into the foyer. Watching the stairs the entire time, she started growling, deep and scared. Her hackles raised, running clear down her back to her rump. She backed up, never taking her eyes from the stairs. There wasn't much sound, an odd shuffling noise. But there were plenty of times over the years with plainly clear footsteps on the stairs. This strange shuffle was low and had no cadence to it. By this time, I was standing at the arch, looking into the foyer and at the stairs. A little part of me thought of grabbing my phone and snapping random pictures. But I'll be honest, what with the strange shuffle and the fact the nanny got less and less active as us kids grew up to the point where I wasn't even sure she was still active, and remembering the basement incident, more on that later, I chickened out. I decided I didn't want to know what was coming down the stairs. My dog ended up behind my legs, growing in the foyer. I eventually got her calmed down and went back to the couch. And well, life went on. So the second time I saw my nanny, I was around 13. Sitting on the couch watching TV. I can't say why, maybe a brief movement in the peripherals. But I turned and looked through the door to the dining room, and quite simply, she was just standing there. She was in front of the mantel, seemingly looking at the mirror we had hanging above. I just kind of froze and watched her. I'm sure it didn't last long, but it felt like several minutes. She eventually turned away from me, back towards the center of the room. And as she stepped away, that was just kind of it. She was gone. I flared this doppelganger because of this weirdness. I really don't have any idea about this experience. It was super odd and strange. But I was probably in my last year or two of high school. I was in my room playing games when my mom popped her head in and was like, "Oh, this is where you ran off to. Did I bore you that much?" To which I intelligently replied, "Huh?" Long story short, my mom insisted I spent the last solid 20 minutes sitting at the kitchen table talking to her as she cooked dinner. Not even about anything unusual or scary, just regular everyday conversation. When she turned around and I was just gone, she swears to this day I was in the kitchen with her, and I know I had been in my room the whole time. Just to warn you guys, I know some of you are going to find this experience anticlimactic, but all I can say is that from my standpoint, this was a very powerful and scary experience. I was 16 or so, and had gone to the basement for some reason, which honestly I can't even remember now. But as I was down there, I heard movement behind me and a raspy breath sound. Before I could even turn around, there was thunderous booming. The entire basement seemed to shake. I honestly thought the house was coming down on my head. Crashing and banging and booming, it truly was deafening. The feeling I'll never be able to get across. I could feel this thing, this whatever, all around me. I have no shame. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I dashed up the stairs and out the door to the back patio. I hung onto the knob, not daring to let it go. I stood staring, my eyes not leaving the door, waiting for something to pull the curtain back and peer at me through the glass. I'm sure it was seconds, but it felt like forever. My knuckles white on the knob. Nothing happened. I fished the keys out one-handed and locked the door, only then letting go and stepping back and looking at the house, wondering if the roof caved or a drunk driver crashed into the house. I walked around the house and back in, shaken. And this is where it gets kind of good. My dad was immediately like, "What did you do?" And it turns out my dad and mom and sister all heard the banging, but from their side, they said it sounded like it was coming from the basement. From my side, it sounded like it was coming from above me. At this time, my dad was still insisting we were all crazy and there was nothing in the house. He would eventually admit that he had seen, felt, and heard things in the house as well. This incident was in fact the turning point, so he said it was nothing. I had scared myself and knocked over a workbench or something, and that I had to go down and clean it up. I flatly refused. My dad grumbled, but went down to clean up my mess. He was gone several minutes. I told my mom and sister about what happened in the basement. When he returned, we all looked at him expectantly. I said, "So what fell?" He looked pretty sheepish and muttered, "Nothing." Everything was just where it was supposed to be. All that horrible noise we all heard, and nothing was out of place. It was a while before I went back to the basement. The experience honestly scared me. Okay, so this really is the last thing from the old house. Though I've had a few strange things happen in the new place, it's nothing like the old house in frequency or intensity. I flared this because, frankly, I didn't know what else it could be. This is one of the odd things in the house, like the doppelganger, that I never understood. It just kind of seemed to happen. It was like the last year and a half I lived the house. Now, nothing had really changed. Didn't even start packing boxes and shuffling furniture until the last couple months I was there. It started small. I would see strange movements in the shadows. Small and quick enough, I pretty much convinced myself it was all in my head. But eventually, the shadows seemed to form, I don't know, almost like little forms, separate from the surrounding darkness and shadows. They were small and not very much like people. By the time I moved out, they had grown to be about 3 feet. The form honestly looked like a little kid wearing a sheet as a ghost costume. Just a rounded top on a cylindrical body. My dog would react to them too. They seemed concentrated in the second master bedroom, which I had converted into a library. They were quick and darted about my bookcases. I never saw more than 2 move at the same time, but by the end, I usually saw at least 1 every day. I just kind of silently made a deal in my head I would leave them alone, as long as they didn't try to hurt my dog. Super weird, but honestly, nothing much else happened with them. I will say, just for full disclosure, I was getting pretty nasty headaches at the time, as well as dreams I prefer not to talk about. But I can't honestly say I know it was all connected. And I admit, even I take such experiences as people talking about dreams with a large grain of salt. The human brain is a weird and scary thing sometimes. But as I said, just to answer any potential questions about the strange little darting shadows, those were things that were happening to me at the time as well. I, female 20 at the time, have had no history of mental illnesses, other than depression, anxiety when I was in my teens. I don't much dabble in the occult anymore, though I did when I was super little. I don't know if this means anything to anyone, but I'm an American with third generation Sicilian blood. I won't give my last name, but it literally translates to fish. My family have been a part of Sicily for so long, I believe there's a town that's named after us. We've been fishermen since the Romans, I think. And even after we moved to America, we kept fishing until my dad was born. I don't super believe in past lives or ancestral help, so I've never assumed my fascination with the ocean was much more than just liking the water. I only bring this up because I've got a medium friend who thinks it could be related. I don't know. I grew up in California and absolutely loved the ocean. I wanted to be as close to it as I could. My grandfather passed away, and so I didn't grow up fishing at all, but I was weirdly comforted by it. Anyways, one day I got to go with my mom on a business trip to Monaco. It was my first time leaving America, and I didn't realize, but it was going to be my first time in the Mediterranean Sea. I remember the night that we arrived, there was a huge company party at the hotel we were staying at, but I couldn't focus on what was going on. I needed to go. I was feeling super weird, not like anxious, but like there was something I was forgetting. I told my mom I'd be right back and went to the front of the hotel. I wasn't totally sure what I was doing, but I felt like I had to go. As soon as I got away from the hotel, I looked up and saw the reddest, largest harvest moon I had ever seen. It felt like a shock run through me. Like I wasn't supposed to be seeing it, but I couldn't look away. And then just like that, I felt pulled to the ocean. I took off my shoes and walked into the beach. If you don't know, Monaco doesn't have naturally sandy beaches. They're all incredibly rocky. But it was like I could feel the pain of the rocks, but I had to keep moving toward the ocean. There was a man there, and I remember him saying something to me, but I can't remember what it was. It was too dark to make out what he looked like. I walked past him and kept going till he reached the ocean, and the water was up to my knees. I kept looking up at the red moon. I don't know how long I was there for, but I remember feeling the whole time while I was there. I remember not wanting to leave, like I was supposed to be here, and any time I wasn't would be wasted. It was like a weird inner euphoria. When I did eventually pull away, it was like I was snapped back into reality. My feet hurt from the rocks. I wanted my jacket. I remember thinking, what the fuck are you doing out here, barefoot in an ocean you don't know in the middle of the night? And I ran back. Nothing like that has ever happened again. Have you been through anything like that? It felt like a trance. So I won't go into too much background, but I was heavily addicted to drugs basically from 14 until December of 2019. I've had some slips, but I've been solidly clean for 5 months now. It's been a journey. There were so many reasons for my addiction, but one thing I could never deal with was my sexual trauma. I mention this because I feel like this made my spirit susceptible to letting this incubus into my dreams. It started in 2015. I'd get these horrible nightmares, always pretty much the same thing, but they always felt so fucking real. I was always running from what I knew had to be a male demon. He had wings and claws and literally looked like a demon out of those old 1700s religious paintings. It was just the most evil looking thing I'd ever seen in my life. What was even scarier was the fear I felt in these dreams. I've never ever felt this scared in my life, ever. It was the worst feeling, and honestly, it's hard to even put into words just how terrifying this thing made me feel. Every time I was running, I knew I was running for my fucking life. And I also knew he wanted to rape me if he caught me. The worst times, he would catch me and rape me, his fingers grabbing and scratching and hurting me. I remember waking up not knowing where I was or who I was, just screaming and hyperventilating until I fell back asleep. When I had a boyfriend, I would wake him up because I'd either be hyperventilating or crying in my sleep, and he'd know to wake me up. Sometimes my hyperventilating would be so bad, it would wake me up out of my dream on my own. Even when I started getting clean, the dreams were still so bad that they would make me relapse, or I would take pills to make them go away. I always thought they were just nightmares from my trauma, but I've just never had such vivid dreams like I did when I had that specific dream. And also, I read up on incubuses, and everything written about them is what I experienced. I wanted to see if anyone else has any experience with their own incubus or succubus. My grandmother died of cancer earlier this year in May. I lived with her for most of my life and was her live-in caretaker up until her death. I had a memorable moment with her while she was still lucid and said everything that I wanted to, so I have no regrets about her death. It's important to know that both my grandmother and grandfather both died in this house, 10 years apart. I'm now in the process of buying a house. However, not much has been changed on the inside. The process has been fraught with greed on the part of my mother and one aunt who are two of the three owners of the house. My mother has never been a mom to me, hence why I lived with my grandmother. I woke up this morning and looked at the wall of family photos in the living room and noticed one was missing. Half asleep still, it wasn't immediately apparent what one it was. I went over to look and found the photo of my mom holding me as a toddler behind my grandmother's chair, which was under it. Nobody has been in the house but I, and I have no animals. The photo was secured on a hook that was still intact. You must lift the frame straight up about a 1/4 inch to remove it from the wall, so simply banging on the wall or slamming a door wouldn't affect it. I cannot find a logical explanation for how the photo got off the wall, no matter how hard I try. I feel like the photo was something my grandmother did, but what could it mean? Of the 12 photos of various family members, some of the same person or couple, that was the only one that was disturbed. So I'm 20 now. This story is from when I was very little, so I don't remember everything about it. My mother was pregnant with my sister. The doctor had told my mother on one of her scans it seemed as though they were twins. However, one didn't develop properly, and therefore my sister absorbed the other. Anyway, the doctor had broken the news to my mother, and it was highly likely that she would lose my sister, or herself would die. Neither happened. Fast forward 8 or so months, my sister is born. Upon bringing her home, little me was shown my sister. I looked at my mother and asked, "Where's the other baby?" And my mother replied, "What other baby? This is the only one." I specifically said, "No, there's another baby." My mother and father were shocked. Nobody had told me about the difficulties in my mother's pregnancy, let alone there was supposed to be a twin. To make things even weirder, my mother was on birth control a few years later. She was told she was pregnant unexpectedly, to which she attempted to terminate. It was unsuccessful, and now I have another sibling. It's not as interesting as others, but I have no memory of it and constantly wonder how I knew. There was a time period in my life, maybe 1 to 2 years, when I was a kid, about 3 or 6 years old, when I would sometimes see these totally pale white/albino, lifeless, blank-faced people-like figures, covered in blots of blood, walking around in the sidewalks outside my home. They were expressionless and always looked directly in front of them where they were walking, never facing anyone, but somehow I knew that if I did get one to face me, I'd be in big trouble. They disturbed the hell out of me, but I never brought any attention to them, never told anyone about them. Important thing to note is that these humanoid figures always captured my immediate attention. They would pull me out of my non-attentive daydreaming self, while no one else noticed them, which is why I remember seeing these occurrences to this day. I even remember having a slighting of these two figures, as stupid as it sounds, once holding hands, walking, expressionless, all stiff and robotic, as they usually did. When my mom and I were walking the streets of Mexico at night back to her family's house, which was away from my home in the US, she never noticed them. So what do you guys think all that was? Just my kid's self having dreams, mistaking them for real life occurrences? Or was I actually seeing some shit? Just to clarify, I only saw them maybe about 3 or 4 times, within a time span of a year or two, with the sights occurring at night time around the streets of my house, once in Mexico at night and once in broad daylight, again around my house. I work in IT, and so I'm constantly being pressed into action by friends and family to sort out literally any technology-related issues. About 10 years ago, I was visiting my parents and they mentioned that a friend of theirs was seriously ill. He had developed motor neuron disease, and over the course of a few months, he had become bedridden and unable to function. My mother mentioned that their friends relied heavily on their computer to communicate with people, sort out appointments and medication, and order groceries as they obviously couldn't leave the house. The computer had developed some problem, and would I mind having a look at it? My dad and I went over to see them, and the man's condition was as described to me. He was in a bed in an alcove in the living room, in front of the TV. He had trouble speaking, though he could make himself understood. It just took him a bit longer. I basically decided to reinstall the OS on their PC, and did so while my dad chatted to him and his wife about everything and nothing. I finished the IT task, but I needed a password to make sure they could get into their email. The lady didn't know it, but the man was eventually able to communicate to me, and it worked. They were very grateful. As we were about to leave, we were stood at the side of the bed, level with the man's head. He struggled to say something. We listened closely and eventually worked out what he was saying. Who was at the end of the bed? The man in black. His wife assured him there was only us there. I was thoroughly creeped out, but we just said our goodbyes and left about 6 p.m. and went back to my parents' house. Later that night, around 10:30 p.m, the phone rang, and when my mother answered it, I knew it instantly what it was. Just a gut feeling. It was the wife ringing my mother to say the man had died within the last hour. This is the weirdest story of my whole life. I haven't told anyone about it except a friend who laughed at me. This is all real, and I'm not lying. My brother works for my parents. He went home with his truck at noon to eat with us. He's 10 years older than me, and we weren't on good terms when the story happened. I was 19 years old at the time. So it was June, and my parents weren't here for the whole day. I was supposed to cook pasta for my brother and his girlfriend when they would be home. You need to understand that the truck makes a lot of noise and that my dogs are super sensitive to the sound of any car in our alley. We have a portal, so only us can go here. It was 11 a.m. and my dogs began to bark. I hear the sounds of the trucks, and I swear to God, I have seen this black truck parking in the alley. So I let the dogs go outside, and they go near my brother, playing with him. The dogs hate being outside alone. Like they bark and scream like babies in front of our doors if there isn't anyone out there with them. But this day, the dogs stayed quiet. They were with my brother, after all, nothing abnormal. I kept watching the TV, thinking that my brother could cook himself since he was home earlier. I know he needed to take his girlfriend from her school, but it was only around noon, and it was like 20 past 11, so there was plenty of time. I keep watching TV until I hear the trucks again and the doors open. It was my brother with his girlfriend. He was super mad at me because the cooking wasn't ready. I told him he could have done it because he was home so early instead of doing nothing. He looked at me like I was crazy and told me he wasn't home at all, he'd just arrived. He had a busy morning and was almost late to be at school for his girlfriend on time. After that, we had one of our worst ever arguments. I still don't know what happened. I saw his tracks. The dogs saw it too. The dogs wouldn't have stayed with anyone else outside that long anyway. He has no interest in lying about this at all. My first place I lived alone, and with my 2 kids at the time, came with some very strange, unexplainable experiences. To start, I found this mediocre, small, worn-down trailer for less than $500 a month, and as a single mom at the time, I jumped on it. The landlord told me to leave the mirrors up though. No biggie, I didn't think much of it. I'm not much of a believer in the paranormal, so I just assumed she liked the decor a certain way. The mirrors were in places I couldn't even reach. One was in the living room/kitchen area, and one was basically bolted to the wall. I couldn't move it if I wanted to. It looked out of place, but I didn't think anything of it. The other was in the hallway, and even on my tiptoes, I could only see the top of my hair. I'm a solid 5 foot. So like I said, I didn't think it was a big deal. But as time went by, things got so weird, to the point that I just cannot come up with any explanation to what was going on. I began hearing footsteps, as if a child was running down the hallway by my bedroom door every night, sometimes multiple times a night, yet my kids were fast asleep. I wasn't in close proximity to any neighbours. I thought, maybe an animal? But the timing was just so consistent and the steps were always exactly the same. Even friends would point it out when they would come over. But I just got so tired of worrying, I just ignored it. Told them it was just a ghost and laughed it off. Well, that's when I started having the worst fucking nightmares of my life. My sleep paralysis started again. I had a nightmare where I stared at myself in a mirror and said, I don't believe in the devil. I'm an atheist. And watched my face morph into some demonic contortion. Scared the actual hell out of me. Some other weird things happened, but those were the most memorable for me. So I found out that I had a friend who rented a house not far from me, from the same landlord who also told her to keep her mirrors up, and had something very similar happen. But she had an older daughter who began saying that she saw a girl in their house. Things got really bad for them, and she eventually had a priest come and bless her house. She took her mirrors down after the priest, and apparently things got better. I don't personally believe in the whole priest blessing my house thing. As I've said, I'm not religious at all. And before this experience, I've never believed in anything paranormal. I've always been able to explain things away, but this whole experience was really weird. And I think the mirrors had something to do with it. But what? This story takes place over several years and happened while I was in late high school/early community college. My 2 best friends lived directly across the street from one another. Mike had been there most of his life, and Rob and his parents moved in directly across the street. We used their street as a headquarters/chill spot, and would spend most of our days together. It was always us 3 and then random friends that would come and go as well. Since Rob's house was bigger, the 3 of us, along with anyone else that joined, would all gather primarily in his house, as it had a large, finished basement, and it was easier to just be teenagers down there. Rob also used it as his computer room and for band practice. Weird things started to happen that we couldn't explain. Entire groups of people were experiencing this, so I know we weren't crazy. It bothered some of us, but for the most part, we were just curious about it. Being teenagers, we all just instantly classified it as demons, of course. Off the top of my head, here are some isolated events. Heavy footsteps in the middle of the night. We went upstairs, grabbed kitchen knives, walked the whole house, even upstairs, and both his parents were dead asleep, and didn't see anything. Upon further inspection, we noticed a sand dollar decoration that Rob's mom had set on the living room coffee table was smashed to pieces, just sitting on the coffee table as if struck with a hammer. We also inspected the old grandfather clock and noticed the pendulum wasn't swinging. It usually does. The clock was icy cold to the touch. Following a party, all of us crashed in the basement. I want to say there were at least 5 people there. We kept hearing this weird 8-bit music coming from an unidentifiable source. No matter where we looked, the sounds seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. None of us were able to identify what the tune or melody was. One of our friends got upset and went home. Another night, Mike saw a shadow figure go into the laundry room. It was a room connected to the basement. And when he turned the light on and went in there, of course, there was nothing there. All of us were accounted for, so it wasn't anyone pulling a prank. I wasn't there for this one, but Rob and Mike were hanging out alone at Rob's house and claimed that they had to lock themselves in one of the bedrooms upstairs, as they felt something chasing and stalking them. They heard footsteps rushing up the stairs and then at the door. Assorted random events, things being misplaced, strange sounds at night. These would happen periodically over the years. One night, Rob claims that the demon showed itself to him in the basement when he was there alone. It didn't seem threatening. It was a man wearing a denim jacket, standing in the hallway propped up against the wall with his arms crossed. It then dissipated. Rob said he didn't feel threatened or scared, and that he felt rather comfortable with the ghost. There was nothing malicious about it. Since we didn't have a name for it, we decided to just name the ghost Denny because of his denim jacket. We now had a name for it and would refer to this ghost as Denny for the remainder of time. Whenever we'd see Rob at school or around town, we'd ask him if he'd seen or heard Denny. I don't actually remember if he saw the apparition again, but small things would happen here or there, and we'd all just chalk it up to Denny and move on with our days. We officially stopped being afraid of it, strangely. One day, I was hanging out with Mike and his mom across the street. Rob wasn't home, so it was just us. Mike's mom had been a local bartender in the area for decades, and we were just sharing some Denny stories with her. I'm pretty sure a Denny event happened the day prior, so we were just giving her a recap of what we'd experienced. Keep in mind, we hadn't mentioned the name Denny to her, as she didn't have any context, so we just referred to it as the ghost when speaking with her. She goes on to tell us that she knew that man that lived there before Rob and his family moved in. He was a local at the bar she worked at, and he had apparently died of brain cancer some time ago. When we asked her what his name was, she said, yeah, his name was Dennis, but we all called him Denny. I felt like I had just been struck by lightning. Rob claims the activity had stopped completely since then. Had we given this spirit peace by acknowledging him or befriending him? Did he finally go to the other side because we learned his backstory? How is it possible that he told us his name without ever actually telling us his name? I have so many questions. So I've had a lot of paranormal experiences, and I've definitely got a sensitivity to it. Sometimes it's a benevolent experience, but this one was by far the most malevolent I've ever encountered. It's also the reason I will never, ever joke about the paranormal. To set the scene, I lived off campus with friends during university in a 2-story flat. It wasn't a glamorous place. In fact, it was a bit worn down and creepy. On our first night, my best friend and I are getting settled in and start making jokes about how unsettling the place is, trying to spook each other out. Our bedrooms share a wall, so at one point whilst going to the loo, I start tapping on the wall. And then when I came back in, I swore up and down it had nothing to do with me trying to scare her. All fun and games. Until, that is, I go back to my room to call it a night, and I can't open my door. At all. This door has no lock, and it's not jammed, but I can feel there is a weight behind it. So I shove the door, and behind it find all of my books piled up to block it. Things escalated from there. Sorry if this seems jumbled. I had a walk-in wardrobe, which was always ice cold, no matter how warm the rest of the flat was. I'd shut the door to go to sleep and wake with it wide open. This room was in the centre of the footprint of the flat. It had no drafts. I ended up blocking it with furniture. The staircase to our top floor had no windows. You needed lights on all day and night to use them, which you could turn on and off at the top and bottom. Almost every time one of us used the stairs, the lights would turn off and plunge us into darkness. There was also a loft hatch in that hallway that always had these dusty handprints which always seemed like they were in slightly different positions every now and then. The smoke alarm bleeped once every 43 seconds. For the entire time we lived there, it drove us crazy. The batteries were replaced, the alarm replaced, nothing worked, and we had to live with it. I also felt like I was always being watched. And the worst thing was if I were in the house alone on my way out, I would feel like I was being chased. I can't describe the panic I would feel. Literally like I was being driven out the door. I never felt that dread once I was outside. The final straw came one night when I was sat in bed next to my window. Out of nowhere, the window shattered next to my face, and you can bet it scared the ever-loving Scoobies out of me. I slept in my friend's room that night, thinking someone had thrown something at the window. But when I went to see in the daylight, I found that only the inside pane of the double glazing was shattered. The landlord came to check it out, and they found that a beam in the loft had broken and fallen directly above my bed. No sign of rot, etc. It just snapped. I took the hint and left that day, commuted to uni for the rest of the year. I'm convinced that whatever that thing was, it hated me. And I always felt like it's because I mocked the paranormal my first night there. In one of my many homes as a teen, we moved a lot. I realized we were sharing our home with someone else. At this point, I've experienced a fair bit of paranormal activity, and I have a pretty good nose for bad or good energies. I knew this house has no bad entities. I'm certain that this was an old man, presumably someone who once lived at the house, and every single night was the same. He would climb the stairs, walk back and forth across the landing, turning lights on and off, and then nothing. Always at 11 p.m. The noises were very distinctive. It was unmistakably the sound of someone walking at a steady pace up the full flight of stairs. The lights would click, but didn't actually turn on. It all felt very solid. So much so that the first couple of times I would go check if my sister was up. In the end, it was apparent that he was doing his own thing and wasn't bothered by us. In fact, I'm not sure he was aware of us at all. I always found him a calm presence, and I like to remember that the paranormal doesn't always need to be frightening. I was looking for a place to share this kind of thing. I have a lot of weird experiences in different places. However, it's been 8 months since I've started working on the night shift in a hotel. Nobody told me anything until I started asking because of weird experiences. My shift starts at 10 p.m. and ends at 8 a.m. I honestly love it because it gave me time to dedicate to my hobbies since I only need to answer the phone and give keys. It was rather sooner than later that I started to notice weird things. For example, it's really common to see the lights in the hallway of the second floor turning on and off during the night. Sometimes some doors will get open or closed without anyone near them. At the end of the hallway of the first floor, sometimes you can see a shadow person at the end. You can also hear someone say your name in a low tone, or hear people talking at night hours of the night. I'm the only worker at night, and most of the people that come here come for work, so they get to bed really early. The most extreme experience was a day when a girl from the morning shift got here, and we were talking in the kitchen about the day schedule. Without any warning, every cooking pot and cutting board, dozens of them in different sizes, just flew off around the kitchen. Most of my co-workers say that wouldn't work here at night because they have fear of ghosts. But honestly, I'm so used to the things that I've just go and clean any mess made by it during the night. I had been living in a flat with two of my other friends for about 4 to 5 months at this time, and nothing strange or out of the ordinary had happened at all. I was used to the sounds that they would make from their room, if any, so I would have known if it was them. I had been trying to fall asleep for about 30 minutes when I heard this tapping sound coming from my radiator, which was pretty close to my bed. I thought it was weird, but it hadn't been working since I'd moved there, so I knew it wasn't turned on or anything. It would happen in intervals, but then the tapping sounded like it was crawling up the wall. So the first couple of times, it sounded like it was coming directly from the side of me. And slowly, the tapping got higher and higher and louder each time. I kept telling myself, okay, next time this happens, I'm going to get up and turn on the light and see what's happening. But I kept being too scared to move. The tapping sound eventually stopped, but then a few moments later, I had this really creepy, low whispering voice in my ear. If I were to say it sounded more like a female voice, but it was so low and disgruntled, I really had no idea. The first time it happened, I just thought to myself, holy fuck, I need to fall asleep. Thinking I was just really tired and it was from a lack of sleep or something. Then it happened again. The exact same voice. I have no idea what it was saying, but it was clearly trying to say something to me. The first two were pretty quiet, but then when the third one was a little bit louder, I said, oh fuck it, I'm going to talk to my flatmate. I went into his room and asked him, hey man, are you hearing anything weird? I keep hearing this weird tapping in my room and it sounds like someone's whispering in my ear. He said no, but then I asked him if he could come into my room for a few minutes to see if anything happened. And when we went into my room and turned on the lights and sat there for a bit, nothing happened. So I just went back to his room with him and was like, fuck it. If anything else happens, I'll tell you. Now his room was right next to mine. And as soon as I closed his door and opened mine, right when I closed my door, the voice was literally right in my ear and was the loudest it had been. And this time, it sounded very angry. And it had happened when the lights were on. I screamed after being scared shitless and ran back into my friend's room and told him what had happened. And we immediately decided to leave and stay the night at my friend's house. Nothing else happened the rest of the time I stayed there, but it definitely made me scared for the rest of the time being there. Since then, I haven't had anything like this happen to me. Each time I tell this story, it gives me the chills. Easily one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. I've had what can only be described as haunting when I moved into my first flat in Colchester, and I've been followed by something. I was very fortunate in getting the main suite when I moved into the new building. The building is owned by the owner of the George Hotel. This isn't surprising, as the building that was turned into flats is directly next to the George Hotel itself. If you know, you know. The George is famous for being haunted. At the time, the refurbishments had just finished from an old office, I think, to the new 6 properties in the building. I was in my early 20s and was really enjoying the fact that my new flat was roughly 12 footsteps from a large, popular high street bar. Bringing girls back was why. I was number 6 and everything seemed really cool. I was happy and enjoying having my own space as I had just moved out of my parents' house. For some reason, after about 6 months or so, I'd wake up and go to my kitchen and find my bin toppled over and my kettle had been moved. At the time, I didn't believe in such things and just ignored it, thinking there was a rational explanation for everything, right? One day, I was taking my bin bags out to the outside bins for collection when I heard, "Lawrence, can you come here for a moment?" It was my neighbour, Alana. My first thought was, oh man, what now? Have I been gaming too loudly at night or something? But no, she seemed very worried. I remember this conversation like it was yesterday. Alana, so I need to ask you something, but I don't want to make you think I'm crazy or anything like that, but have you noticed anything weird happening around here? Me. My bin, toaster, and kettle seem to move on their own, but I'm sure it's all due to something explainable, right? Like building work making the building shake or something. Alana, I'm so happy you said that. I don't think that's quite it, as more violent things are happening to be in my flat. At this point, I knew she was going to say ghosts or something. And as I say, I was very skeptical then. I wasn't going to be rude about it, so I thought I would just hear her out, reassure her, and then go back to doing what I was doing. This isn't exactly how it went. Alana, who's a very strong, independent, rational, and intelligent person, went on to explain how her duvet has been ripped off of her during the night, and things like her bin lid had been thrown at her with extreme force, as well as things not being where they're supposed to live, just everyday items around the house. Alana took a photo of her fridge. There was a legitimate reason why, but I can't remember. Something about showing her mum what the flat looked like or something. Alana was alone at the time, but in the picture, the reflection on the fridge door reflected the image of her bed, studio flat. And there's a man clear as day sitting on the end. Alana lives alone. I live alone, so I had no explanation. A few nights later, there was a knock on the door, and when I answered, it was her. No hello or sorry to disturb you this late. All she said was, I need to stay here tonight. Bit forward, but whatever. I made up my bed for her and I slept on the sofa in the living room. During that night, my Xbox controller was launched right at my head, breaking it. The controller, not my head, although it hurt like a bitch. This went on for some time, and Alana kept staying at mine, which, during that time, we went on some dates and decided to get together. The process of living together made for a very active nightlife in my flat. On one occasion, my speakers that were not plugged into the power outlet, nor my PC, let out a very loud growl around 3 a.m. I jumped out of bed trying to figure out if there was a grizzly bear. But Alana says, go back to sleep, it's fine. It's just him again. I'd had enough by this point, so agreed with Alana, who had been pestering me, to bring a medium into the flat. I really didn't believe any of that stuff at the time, but if it meant I could sleep again, then I would try anything. The medium came by 2 days later and refused to go in either mine or Alana's flat. She was saying things like, he's really angry and hates women, or he doesn't like men standing in his way. She did say something weird that I still don't quite understand to this day, which was, there's a portal between the two front doors, number 5 and number 6. She left, saying that her presence was making it worse. Honestly, at the time, I thought she was quoting Paranormal Activity, the movie, to look cool. Fat load of goods she was, but we ended up calling her back because something truly awful happened. Roughly a week later, Alana was walking around the flat between the hours of 1 and 3 a.m. I turned the lights on and was asking what she was doing, and she wouldn't respond. She was ice cold and wouldn't talk, but she wouldn't stop staring at me no matter where I was. Okay, so up to now I've been patient, but it's fucking 3 a.m, so if the problem won't leave, what happens if I remove us from the problem? Should fix it, right? I got her dressed and coat on, and we walked out of the flat and up the road, where Alana began speaking, saying things like, we need to go back. Fat chance, love. That place sucks. We got about 3 blocks away, and then Alana said something that legit scared me. Why are we outside by the post office? Okay, well, I think we should move is why we are here. We eventually moved together, but paranormal activity in general would keep happening where we moved. But I can safely say this was nowhere near as angry as whatever the fuck was back at the high street. Due to all the stress of it all, we broke up and went our separate ways. Since then, I got the odd bit of paranormal activity all these years later. I'm 31 and very happy with my new partner, but I wish I knew why that happened and why I still get things happen from time to time. If anyone can enlighten me or educate me on what exactly happened, I would greatly appreciate it. One last additional piece of information is that the medium person said that I'm a beacon. I looked it up and I'm still unsure. I was about 10 or 11 years old when we moved in, and I was excited that we were moving from a small house next to a main busy road in the town centre to an area where there is so much room to explore. I knew that the new house was bigger and had a garden and a woodland area, locally known as Friday Woods, which is just shy of 380 acres approximately. I was thrilled knowing that I could potentially build a fort with sticks and leaves, go camping, walking and exploring, which, to an 11-year-old boy, was enough to sell me on the move. After the move, it was officially day one of living in the new house, and I begged my dad, "Can we go in the woods yet?" My dad has always been fair, so he asked my older sister, 14 years old at the time, to take me. The rules were not to wander away from the path, because he didn't want us to get lost or stuck. My sister had a friend over who agreed to come with us. The three of us set off, and all was well. I couldn't resist but to pick up a stick and pretend it was a sword or a gun, with a want for explanation. About 5 to 10 minutes into the walk, I thought I saw movement in the trees off the path to my left, and spoke up about it. My sister suggested that it might be an animal, and said we should check it out just in case we get lucky on seeing wildlife for the first time. About 100 yards in, there was what looked like a makeshift fence made out of sticks and twigs that went around in a large circle, and in the middle was a hole. The hole was about 2 to 3 feet deep, but was about 8 feet wide all the way around. There was a lot of, "I wonder what this is for," until it started. My sister let out a scream and ran. Me and her friend followed, asking what happened and if she was okay. She said something whispered in her ear and grabbed her shoulder. That's about all I know about that, because she was inconsolable after that. Her friend at that moment let out a scream, saying that she saw something, and she then grabbed my wrist and we ran back down the path, back to the woods entrance and to the house. I really don't remember that much about what happened at home, because my mum and dad had to sit with my sister and her friend behind closed doors to reassure them and make sure they were okay. Like I said, I wasn't in the room at the time. Once they finished talking, they spoke to me. I suppose it's easy to convince a 10-year-old that it was a trick of the light or something. I wasn't overly aware of what just happened, because at that age, it was easy to dismiss things like that due to a lack of knowledge. Ignorance really is bliss. I still haven't found out any more about what happened to my sister, because every time I bring it up, she tells me to drop it and ignore it. And if I press for more information, then she gets apoplectic and shouts at me to drop it. As you can tell, I gave up with that years ago. So that's the prologue, I guess, because that brings up to present day, where a lot has changed. I lived in Cambridge for about 5 years, where I studied at university to get my bachelor's degree. During my last year of university, COVID hit the UK and hit it hard. We were locked down and many were on furlough, while others just straight up lost their job. This means that for a new graduate, there was no work available. My dad agreed to let me come home for a bit while we let COVID blow over for the most part. This is where I am today. I'm job searching and waiting. A few weeks ago, I thought I'd better start exercising and began running and going for walks in the woods to help break up the day. There was never anyone around during the day, so I didn't have to wear a mask. It was perfect. On one of my walks, I walked past the entrance to the witch's den without realizing. It had been so long. When I thought I could hear a girl's voice. It wasn't like a stereotypical witch-like voice with the cackling laughter, green skin on a broomstick type voice. It was way more gentle and sounded younger. I heard it over my headphones and it immediately stopped me in my tracks. I turned and I started walking through the bushes and trees. The voice sounded like a young woman stuck and was shouting for help. I kept going, but the voice sounded eerily comforting and inviting in a pure and innocent way. When I came to the conclusion I fell over, it was the hole in the middle of the witch's den. It was silent. I snapped out of it and decided to get out of there. My mind started going a mile a second as I ran out. How can the girl just stop asking for help and disappear? It was a kind voice, so why did the girl scream all those years ago? Why did I even walk in there in the first place? It's been a few days since then, and I've tried to ignore it, but I keep seeing the lights in the distance from my bedroom window. The witch's den isn't far and can see, just barely, it through the trees. The lights look like people dancing, except they're made of light and dance through the trees. This happened to me in the ruins of St. Lars, which is a Byzantine-style church building in the Hanseatic walled city of Visby, on Gotland. Gotland is an island in the Baltic Sea that's been continuously settled for more than 9,000 years. No DBZ memeing intended. The island's ghost power level is actually factually above 9,000. About the location. The church was founded in the mid-13th century and abandoned in the 16th century. St. Lars has stairs and corridors inside the walls, with small openings and windows facing the church room. It's possible to move to different levels on the church and around almost the entire building. The key word here is almost. What happened? As I explored the many ruins of central Visby alone on a warm but rainy summer's day, I entered through a crack in the wooden framework that usually kept the ruin of St. Lars off limits when no guided tours are held. The ruin was pleasantly cold and the sideways rain couldn't reach me, so I decided to explore a bit. I started climbing the narrow stairs inside of the church's double stone walls in an attempt to reach the walkways under what used to be the church ceiling. Halfway up, I heard a loud and distinct whistle made up of 3 falling notes. Okay, wow. I believed myself to be alone, so I got severe chills there. However, I quickly shook the shock off and reasoned that another unseen explorer was in the staircase above me, behind a corner and up to my right on the 3rd level, nearer the roof. So I rapped the stone walls and cheerily greeted the whistler to avoid a colliding if they descended as I ascended. I turned to the corner, expecting to come face to face with a tourist, and stopped frozen because the roof had caved in and completely blocked the way from where the disembodied whistle had come from. I searched for tripwire, sensors, etc., but found none. Whatever it was, it didn't feel ill-willed, but I noped the fuck out of there with haste. Number 1, man in a commie block. I moved to a UNI city and bought a small flat in a commie block and lived there with my roommates. Once, I had 5 dreams in a dream, inception there. Even one dream in a dream is a significant different mind state. So 5 hit me really hard, with it being so damn hyper-realistic. I was waking up in my bed over and over again, and seeing a man in white clothes and black slicked back hair in my kitchen, which was just a cabinet away from my bed. He was standing there, then jumped off a 6th-story balcony. Woke up again, and I knew he was running back to my flat to either hurt me or jump again. It scared me a lot, because I thought it was really happening. After I woke up for real, I told this to my roommates, and we went on with our day. In the evening, we were taking selfies with an old analog camera, and my roommate was rudely joking about the man from my dream. The second I handed her my camera, the lens broke. The lens was quite new, may I add. I thought weird, but it could be a coincidence. A few days later, I had another terrifying, realistic dream about the man. In the dream, I got up from my bed and saw a painting above my bed of a friend of mine, twisted with bones broken, and I knew the man painted this to hurt me because he hated me for some reason. The second I woke up from this bad dream, I heard a man's laugh coming from right behind me, from the kitchen. It couldn't be my neighbour, because he was crazy and he only said curver or silence. He never laughed or spoke anything else the couple of years we lived there. Besides, the laugh was heard so damn clear in the kitchen. I laid there frozen till the sun started to rise. Then a few weeks later, my boyfriend visited me, and this time I slept well. But he was woken up by a girl's voice saying, "He's standing right behind you." He didn't believe me when I told him about the lens before that night, but the voice made him uneasy. Number 2, little brown-haired girl plus evidence. So a couple of years later, we moved to this new house where I am now. It's a 20-year-old house built on a much older lot, where I think was a different house in the past. The first night I slept here, I had another hyper-realistic dream, just the same vibe as the one with the man. 3 years ago, I had nose surgery, and the anesthesia fucked up my brain a little, so I suffered with hallucinations at night. I can always tell that they are hallucinations. I always get a little scared as a reflex, but I know my brain is playing. In the dream, I woke up, sat up and looked at the door. It was a little open, and there was a little girl's head staring at me. I thought this must be one of those hallucinations. I thought I was awake. I woke up to my boyfriend to ask him if he was seeing it too and expected him to say no, but he said yes. Then the door opened more and a big dog walked in, right up to me, and was also staring at me. I felt the dog was good, but there was something scary about the girl. Morning, I found out that this was just a dream, but it was still on my mind because I felt like it was the same type of dream as with the man in my flat. I haven't had any other dreams like this. Over a few weeks, 2 glasses went missing, and once in a while, there's a sound like something has crashed, but nothing to find on the ground. 2 days ago, I was sharing these experiences somewhere else, and the day after we found a tiny handprint on the mirror. The mirror was polished the day we moved in, and since then, we had no child visitors, no tiny hand people visitors. But there it was, a tiny hand. Half the size of my hand, and my hands are pretty small. I was working night shift in a hospital that's been operating since the 1800s. It's a large manor house and is a specialist hospital for patients with brain injuries, spinal injuries, and physical disabilities. It's a rather large building, but has less than 30 patients at the moment due to COVID, so the entire ground floor is empty. During night shift, the nursing staff are allowed to go into one of the hospital bedrooms downstairs on break to rest, and that's what I did yesterday evening. It was around 1:30 a.m, and no one else was on the ground floor when I heard 3 knocks on the door in a row. I did immediately feel uneasy. The older staff tell stories about the house. It was exercised or something similar 20 years ago, apparently, due to strange things happening during a renovation of the hospital. And that was said to be the unhappy spirits of a matron who hadn't passed on, but the paranormal activity stopped as soon as the hospital was blessed. Generally, the house isn't known for a lot of spirit activity. Maybe the odd door slamming and figure seen reported. I'm used to hearing ghost stories working in hospital settings, but I've never experienced anything too scary myself. I went on to investigate the door, but nothing was there. And when I sat down, it happened again, 3 knocks in a row. So I said to myself, if it happens again, I'm going to go back upstairs to the ward I was working on. It did, and so I got the most awful feeling of dread, and I returned upstairs. The other nurse just laughed, but it did freak me out. I googled 3 knocks in a row and terrified myself even more, learning apparently it's the 3 knocks of death. I wondered if anyone here would know something more. This happened about 7 years ago, and it's never happened since. I was 13, staying up late on a school night. Occasionally, there'd be nights where I would stay up late and be totally awake at around 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. This was one of those nights, and I was scrolling through social media to pass the time. No sounds were happening in my room, TV was off, and I was just on Facebook. The TV in the living room next to me was also off, and the house was, overall, completely silent. My dog was in the room with me, and all of a sudden she starts going crazy at my door, scratching it. I told her to stop, but as soon as I said that, it felt like my gaze was slowly moving to the middle of my door without me trying. When that happened, I heard a woman's voice, clear as day, tell me, "Good night, my name." My dog had stopped scratching a few moments before I heard the voice. I was scared, but I told it good night back in case it was somehow my mom's friend who sleeps over a lot and tells me good night. But no, I knew that wasn't her, so I investigated. That night was a work night for both my mum and her friend, so they were unsurprisingly not home. The only person home was my brother, and I knew it couldn't be him because the voice I heard was feminine in a way that he definitely couldn't imitate. It was a very gentle voice, completely clear and well articulated. I don't know what to make of it, even all these years later. So if anyone has any ideas, please let me know. On Monday this week, I got home from work about 9:15 p.m. I sat in the living room with my two flatmates. They were on the sofas, and I sat on a chair from the dining room table. It's also in the living room. They were watching Sex Education on Netflix and paused it so we could chat as I normally work late, and they both have daytime jobs so we don't actually see much of each other. One of the chairs at the table was a wooden coat hanger that I used to dry my shirt the night before, hanging on it. Anyway, we're talking, and at about 9:45, this wooden coat hanger just starts swinging left and right pretty aggressively. We all stopped and looked at it and experienced this weird moment of silence, like we're all trying to figure out how this just happened. I live with a couple and looked straight at the guy and said, "Did you do that?" He laughed and said, "How could he? He's on the sofa," and that I was closer to the chair than him. I tried to replicate the swinging by pushing the coat hanger, but it didn't have enough momentum as it did on its own. We sort of all expected that it must have been air pressure change or wind or something, but also knowing that it couldn't have been. But the plot thickens. The next day, I'm taking out a bin and I see a neighbour from down the hall who asked, "Were you in last night at 10? I tell her I was with my flatmates. She says, "Why did you not answer the door?" I'm like, "What?" She tells me at about 10 p.m. she could hear a screaming woman coming from my flat, and she thought someone was being murdered or something. She was bashing on our door so loud that the neighbours opposite came out to see what on earth was going on. They also could hear the screaming. They went downstairs to see if it was coming from there, but concluded it was definitely coming from our flat. That gave me goosebumps because at 10 p.m, we were all sitting in the living room talking about this moving coat hanger not making any real noise. And our flat isn't even that big. We would definitely hear a knock at the door, and we didn't hear any screaming or foxes or anything. I told my flatmates and the girl I live with hate stuff like this, so is now petrified of our flat. Anyway, in conclusion, I don't really know what to believe, and I'm struggling to sleep. I grew up a skeptic. In fact, in my senior year of high school, this weird girl in my English class told a story to the whole class about how she moved into a house once and the Scrabble game she had spilled onto the floor and spelled "get out" or some shit. And my teacher gave her a look as if to say, "This bitch." I let out a legitimate sneeze, but ever the sucker for a well-timed joke, I said, "Oh, sorry guys, I'm allergic to bullshit." Just loud enough to where my friends could hear. It got some laughs. Fast forward a year. I was in college during the day, and I worked at McDonald's during the night. I worked for a small franchise. If you don't know how that works, essentially a franchise owner makes their own executive decisions, while adhering to the basic guidelines that McDonald's establishments and gives the franchise owner permission to use their brand. Anyway, one of the liberties my owner at the time took was she had her stores close at 1 a.m. instead of staying open 24 hours a day like most McDonald's do. During the summer of 2013, however, she opted to try keeping us open overnight and into the morning. Aside from seriously pissing me and the girls off, since nobody wanted the closing shift, it was me and like 4 girls who cycled throughout the week so we could all get 2 days off a week. It wasn't too terrible. Because the store closed at 1 a.m. and we'd typically be out there by 1:30 a.m., the store was usually empty from that time until about 4 a.m. when the morning crew would come in. We were in a gas station, one of those half gas stations, half restaurants. And at 11 p.m, we would lock the only exterior entrance to the dining room, and we would close the gate, which, apart from being unnecessarily noisy, was the only other way to get into the restaurant from the convenience store we shared a building with. But the drive-thru would remain open until closing. It was a good system, worked for everyone. When we switched to being a 24-hour location, the dining room still closed at 11 p.m, but the drive-thru would remain open. The layout of the store was such that you could see all the way to the back of the kitchen from the dining room and all the way into the dining room from the kitchen. In other words, there was nothing people on either side of the counter couldn't see. On the first night, not being used to the schedule, it was quite hectic and we were really slammed, but that was the only night with that issue. Every night after that, it was dead. This did afford us some time to clean things we wouldn't ordinarily do, however. One night, about a week after the new schedule went into effect, I found myself cleaning the notorious shake machine when I heard a noise and turned around. What I saw, walking the length of the counter on the customer side, was the form of a human from the mid-thigh up, except it was all black, like a walking shadow. It walked from the side of the counter by the outside door, which remember was locked, to the other end of the counter, where there was a space between it and the wall for employees to come back. There's also the end of the counter with the gate, which, as I mentioned before, was shut and locked, and if you touched it, it would rattle very loudly. I was certain my eyes deceived me, so I went out to the dining room and checked the door, which was certainly locked as it was about 3 a.m. I figured it was my imagination. Then, the next night happened. I was further back in the kitchen, cleaning the grill, breaking down the grill for you former McDonald's employees, and turned to my left to grab a brush, and I saw the exact same thing as the night before, and my blood ran cold, as it's doing as I write this. But I still didn't say anything, thinking it was just my imagination. I had the next 2 nights off, and the night I came back, it was my turn to do dishes, and one of the girls' turn to do the grill, which I was grateful for, because I honestly hated that nasty-ass grill, making me all sweaty and greasy and burning me. I was scrubbing a dirty spatula or something, and then I heard something behind me. So I looked, and I saw the girl there looking in the direction of the front, but otherwise motionless. And I noticed the time was around 3:15. I knew what she saw, so after a minute of watching her stand there with her back to me, motionless and staring at the front, I said, "Tell me what you just saw." And she explained, in detail, the exact thing I had seen my 2 previous shifts. I said something to the effect of, "So now you've seen it too." And she got creeped out. I knew then what I had seen was a ghost. We decided not to tell any of the others, so they, A, wouldn't think we were crazy, and B, on the off chance they believed us, we didn't want to freak them out. This strategy didn't keep a lid on things for too long though, because the very next night, I was working with another one of the girls who saw it and immediately freaked out, causing our manager to come out of the office and ask what had happened. Before she could get out the whole story, the manager stopped her and said, "Oh, that's just George." Admittedly, I don't remember the name, so we'll just say George. And both the girl and I looked at her, and obviously she understood we wanted her to elaborate. She explained that when she started a few years before this took place, she knew an employee who knew someone from when they started years prior who worked there when the store opened some 20 years ago. She said she didn't know the details, but an employee died somehow, and weird stuff started happening soon afterward. This was something we lived with nightly for a few months. Sometimes we'd remark that we saw it, other times not. We would tell any new manager, some had seen it themselves, some only heard of it. Some believed it, others didn't. But we never told new employees about it. We didn't want them to get scared or think we were hazing them. I began dating a manager there, which was a no-no. So I was getting transferred to another store down the road within the franchise. About 3 or 4 days before I was due to transfer, it dawned on me that one of the morning ladies had worked there since it opened. So one morning when she came in, we all stayed after our shifts were over to talk to her on her first break. It was a payday, so we were going to wait for the store manager to pick up the paychecks and bring them in at about 5 a.m. anyway. There were 3 or 4 of us, including this woman, sitting in the break room. I was sitting at the large round table, and the others were sitting on the bench against the wall, nowhere near the table. We decided to tell her about what we had been experiencing, and she immediately finished our own thoughts by telling us what we were about to say, describing it in perfect detail. She went on to tell us that there was a guy in his mid-20s, back about a year after the store was built, who was very troubled and killed himself in a very violent manner, involving a propane explosion in his car. At the time this story takes place, there was a large bound journal with a page or two for every day of the year. It was the responsibility of the staff to write their day off requests in advance in this book, which our manager would refer to when making the week's schedule. That book was the only thing sitting on that table that I was sitting at and remember. There was nobody else near that table. But when I found out the way he died, even the jokester, remember at the beginning of the story, I made some smart remark that I don't remember that was less than sensitive about the guy. And no sooner did the words leave my mouth than the big book flew off of the table as if I had pushed it. We all got up and got the hell out of there. I didn't pick up my check until 3 days later, which was my next, and by coincidence, my last shift there. When I was a young child in the mid to late 90s, I used to have what I believed at the time to be very vivid nightmares. I would be laying in my own bed, completely unable to move any part of my body except my eyes, or make any kind of sound, and the room would become strangely lit, and what I can only describe as fog from dry ice would cover the floor. At the time, I would hear a strange noise similar to a baby cooing or stirring, but not quite. If you play Minecraft, the noises which ghasts make when they're just moving around is almost a dead ringer. And these two human-like entities would walk into my room. They'd be wearing grey clothing like sweatsuits, and their faces, as I remember, were akin to hockey masks, but the entire eye holes were black. Think Shy Guy from Mario. There was a height difference between the two, similar to that which one would expect between a man and a wife, yet there were no defining features of either, aside from that which could be indicative of gender. Upon entering my bedroom, they would very slowly yet steadily approach me, tilting their heads side to side as one might do when approaching a dog or newborn baby. They would draw closer and closer until they reached the edge of my bed, at which time they would just as slowly bend over me until their faces were feet from mine. I experienced this at least a dozen times, and each time was the same, but I have no memory of what would happen after they bent over me. Around this same time period, I would experience nightmares where I was alone outside in the middle of the night in the grass, or on or near the picnic table beside our lawn, unable to move or make any noise. And I remember waking up from these episodes and sometimes being in my own bed, but sometimes being outside and having to make my way back inside, with absolutely no memory of how I got out there in the first place. As an adult, I was performing research on sleep paralysis, having never heard of it, and realised that what I described above could be a textbook example of it. And I thought this for about 5 years, until I described these episodes to my doctor and nurse during a routine checkup, and they both said it sounded like I'd been visited by aliens. I'm still leaning towards sleep paralysis, but you never know. It started when I was a kid. I remember waking up in the night to see a shadow of a man standing in my room watching me sleep. It's not sleep paralysis. I've always been able to move. I remember screaming and running to my parents' room, saying there was a man in my room. They came down, turned the lights on, and showed me my room and no man in it. Told me it was a nightmare and to go back to sleep. Years later, I'm a teenager and I fell asleep on my couch. I wake up in the middle of the night and hear breathing over the top of me, and I get the sense that a man is watching me sleep. I spring up, look everywhere, and check that all my doors and windows are locked. This happens from time to time over the years. My latest encounter, I'm getting ready to sleep when I notice a shadowy man standing at the end of my bed watching me. I tell him I don't want to play, and I go to turn over, and as my foot turns over on the bed, I feel the tops of knuckles on my foot. Whatever the shadow people are, they're the only thing that I have felt. Somehow they can touch you, breathe on you, so I know it's not a ghost. I've listened to podcasts about Shadow Men and the Hat Man. Some say they are being that delivers a warning before something terrible happens. Though nothing terrible comes to mind when I've seen them. Have you seen a Shadow Man? What do you think they are? So this happened when I was about 7 years old. My parents had taken me and my brothers on a trip to their hometown in Mexico. We had just arrived that same night and stayed at my maternal grandma's house. It was maybe 2 or 3 a.m. We all got situated in the living room where my grandma had a few beds and couches for us to sleep in. I shared a bed with my mom while my 2 older brothers shared a bed, and my dad slept on a nearby couch. Everyone fell asleep pretty instantly. Everyone except me, that is. I remember I kept looking at the clock my grandma had placed on a counter to the left of the bed I was sleeping in. I was excitedly waiting for daylight, as that would mean I would get to go see my paternal grandma. She was also my favourite due to her love for animals. Time had passed, and it was now around 4:30 a.m. Not yet daylight, but we were closing in on it. I recall turning my head to see my mom, who was laying on my right side. She was laying face up in a deep sleep. Then I saw it, a dark, unusually pitch black hand, coming up from where the bed met the wall. It slowly came up, the palm facing my mom's head, ready to grab it. I remember being very confused. Our bed was pressed tightly against the wall, too tight for even my hand to squeeze through. How could this hand do so? How did it fit? I recall thinking, how could it be so black? The room had a blue way to it, the type of way it would have been when your eyes have already adjusted to the dark. Nothing in the room compared to how pitch black this hand was. Everything had a shade of colour to it. This hand didn't. I stared at my own hand for a second, then back at this one, to compare the difference in colour. Even in the dark, mine had a shade of colour to it. This one was pure black. I stared at it for about 5 to 10 seconds as it made its full, slow motion towards my mom's head. Then in an instant, the palm turned and faced me, and immediately retracted down between the bed and wall. It was as if I caught it doing something it wasn't supposed to be doing, like it saw me with its palm when it turned to face me. I lay there in pure confusion, trying to process how it fit, why it was so dark, how it saw me, but I had no fear. At some point, the dark figure didn't bother my confused 7-year-old mind anymore. I went back to impatiently waiting for daylight, again thinking of seeing my grandma and her pets. My dad woke up at about 5:30, and at about 6 a.m, we were both off to see my grandma, leaving everyone else asleep. Our trip went on without me witnessing any other strange occurrences, and we went home back to the United States. For years, I never told my mom what I saw. I honestly didn't see the importance in it. Then one day, when I was about 10 years old, I heard my mom telling my aunt about how she constantly felt something pulling her hair at night, here in our United States home. I kept knowledge a secret until I was about 16, after we had our house blessed due to unnatural occurrences. I casually brought up what I saw in Mexico to my mom. She was shocked and had so many questions, but I had little to no answers. To this day, she fears that this thing may have been following her up until our home was blessed, and she fears it may come back. My dad never had much money to buy us new toys or games. So when we were kids, he would take my family and I to yard sales. For those who don't know, yard sales are basically sales people would host in their front yards to sell their items. Sometimes we would get lucky and find new things. Other times, they'd be used but in fairly great condition. One man's trash is another man's treasure. So for us kids, these sales meant we would get new toys. Well, one day, my dad went to some yard sales on his own, and he came back with random things he bought. Among them was a used basketball. Of course, the basketball was in pretty great condition, no holes or tears in it. It just looked a bit dirty, which is understandable for any kind of ball. I can't honestly recall if I personally played with it that same day, but my brothers did. And when they were done, they placed the ball on the floor, next to my mom's bedroom window. That same night, my mom heard the ball rhythmically bouncing outside. The sound of the ball bouncing happened every 5 or so seconds, as if the person would bounce it, catch and hold it, before releasing it to bounce once more. She got upset, thinking my brothers were outside playing after hours, and peeked outside the window to verbally discipline them. But no one was outside, just the ball sitting on the floor, where they had originally left it earlier that day. My mom brushed it off, thinking she was imagining the situation, and went back to sleep. But as the nights went on, she continued to hear the ball bounce, in the same rhythm, but saw no one around whenever she checked. She would ask my brothers if they were outside playing, but they would say no. She would ask me if I heard it, since I shared the room with her, but I was such a heavy sleeper, I never woke up for these events. My dad also claimed he never heard the ball and told my mom she was just imagining the situation. It got to the point she was so annoyed with the occurrences, she grabbed the ball and moved it to the back left side of our home, where my aunt's room was located. The next morning, my aunt came to my mom. "Were the kids playing by my window last night?" she asked. My mom said no and asked her why she was asking, although she already knew the answer. "I heard a ball bouncing outside my window during the night and thought it was them." They both compared their experiences, confirming the bounces occurred in a specific rhythm. And with that, my mom grabbed the basketball, popped it with a knife, and threw it in the trash. The occurrence never happened again. My family has had strange experiences happen in that home. I never knew whether or not something was just attached to the ball itself, or if it was just one of the spirits that already resided within that house. As I mentioned before, the bouncing ball occurrence ended as soon as she got rid of the ball, but the rest of the odd occurrences in the home continued. Back in May, I lost a friend to suicide. She planned the entire thing out for over a year and none of us had a clue. She didn't leave a note or anything hinting as to why, But through the actions she took on her final day, we realised just how thoroughly she planned it out, and just how much she no longer wanted to be here. It was honestly what everyone says. They were the life of the party, always happy, full of life, full of joy, full of love. And now we understand. We missed the signs. I found out 10 days after her passing. 2 days later, it was a Monday morning. I got into my car and turned it on. It instantly started playing Logic's 1-800 song. For those who don't know, this song is about suicide. I found it odd. My car normally picks a random song. But did it really have to be that song today? So, I decided to let it continue as I drove to work. The song ended, then it began once more on replay. I don't play my music on replay. I let it play again, and it replayed for a third time. By this time, I arrived at work, trying my hardest not to break down. About an hour went by, and I got a message from my friends saying, "Hey, today's the viewing." I left work early, went home to change into a white outfit. Her family asked for a white dress code. Picked up white roses, and with that, we set off to see her one last time. It was a beautiful service. Everything was white. During the service, a bird flew into the church. It landed directly above her casket, all the way in front of the church. It sat there for about 5 minutes facing the crowd. Then, it flew to the back and landed directly above her boyfriend, where it remained for the rest of the service. A few days after the service, I had a dream about her. We were in a white room, sitting on a white bed. We talked for a while. It felt so peaceful, so warm. I know I asked her why she left, and I know she told me why. But when I woke up, all I could remember was that we talked for a while, and her beautiful, peaceful smile. But I couldn't remember anything about what she was said. About a week later, I was having a rough day thinking about her. So when I left work, I asked her for a sign to let us know she was okay. I drove off, ran some errands, and went home. When I parked, I sat there for a moment just thinking of her. Then I realised my music had stopped playing. I grabbed my phone and kept pressing the play button, but it wouldn't play. Then I looked at the song itself, Life Goes On by Tupac. After I read it, it began to play. After this, I began noticing the times. 1:11, 11:11, 10:11, 11:01. Whenever I would have a rough day thinking of her. As I write this, I notice 11:01. One day, I was out with her boyfriend. He and I have been friends since kinder, and he's the reason we all met her. And he shouted, "It's 1:11. I've been getting those a lot lately." And I looked at him in shock and said, "You too?" He's had more strange experiences since her passing than I. About a month ago, a friend of mine found 3 abandoned kittens. I picked them up because I normally shelter kittens until they're old enough to find homes. I showed her boyfriend a photo of the kittens, and he suddenly had a shocked expression. Those 2 are the exact same colour as the 2 she adopted before passing. Monday of this week, I picked up a buddy of ours who had just returned from deployment. He was away for her passing and for her funeral. I filled him in on her last day and on the experiences after. He said he'd been ignoring any signs since her passing. He just wants to move on, and they make it harder. As we talked, I looked at the clock and told him, "What did I tell you? It's 11:11. As of yesterday, I began noticing more repeating numbers, not just my usual repeating ones. Well, these are just a few of the experiences that have happened since her passing. I'm not sure how to make them or what they could mean exactly. And maybe some of you may have some insight, so I just thought I'd share. That, and I find peace in writing. I live alone. Have done for about a year now after breaking up with my ex. And it's been mostly great to have my own space in my own house, where I'm free to do whatever I want, whenever I want. That said, I spend most of my time in the evenings upstairs playing video games and watching YouTube videos. I don't really have a social life, but that's okay with me. I've never felt uneasy in my own house, until about a month ago, when I went to the kitchen at night to make a drink. Now, my kitchen is overlooked by my overgrown garden, which is in turn overlooked by some woods. It's a fairly rural neighbourhood and it's very quiet at night, which makes it a friendly environment for some wildlife to come out. I'll often see foxes and deer, and I've woken up at night by the scream of a fox at 4 a.m. once. And they like to hang around outside the front of my house, because there's easy access from there to my back garden and then into the woods. My kitchen has this big window, which looks right into the garden. But at night, when the lights are on, I can barely see any more than a few feet ahead of the window, as it acts sort of like a mirror. Well, on this particular night, the few feet ahead of me that I could see was all this thing needed to make itself visible to me. I hadn't noticed it until I looked up and out of the window after making my drink. It was a bipedal creature, skinny but very tall with hind legs and had no hair. It sounds ridiculous, but it looked similar to the werewolf Lupin, transformed into the Prisoner of Azkaban movie, only taller and more humanoid, and its mouth was tiny but protruded, similarly to a canine's. It had no ears from what I could see. It just stayed there looking at me with these completely white, tiny eyes. Its head was tilted to the side and its bottom jaw was slightly open. I didn't even know how long it had been there. I was in the kitchen for about a minute before I even bothered to look out of the window. I just froze. You think you can rationalize what you do in situations like this, but I was frozen in terror. I was telling myself to move, but my body felt icy cold. I couldn't do anything. Eventually, after like 10 seconds, it felt much longer, I managed to move and ran out of the room, not daring to take my eyes off the creature. And as I did so, its head rotated to follow me as I left to the comfort of the upstairs, which was the creepiest thing about it. Since then, which was about a month ago, I've not gone into my kitchen at night, save for a few necessary occasions. I'm preparing everything I need before it gets dark, and then staying upstairs for the rest of the night. If I absolutely need to go in the kitchen, I'll rush so I can get out ASAP. That feeling you get when you turn all the lights off before you have to go back upstairs and feel like you're going to be chased upstairs by some unknown entity? That's the feeling I get when I need to go in my kitchen at night. When I was born, my mom didn't know she was having twins. When me and my sister were born, we were brought from the hospital to a haunted house. Growing up in this house and the postpartum circumstances of my mother seemed natural to me. I was a newborn, as was my twin. We knew nothing else. Our mother thought we were the devil's spawn. I would have too, if I didn't know they were coming in pairs. My father would change our diapers, feed us throughout the day, get little sleep, and work the night shift. He'd come home on his lunch break at midnight to feed us and clean us and change our diapers. My mother wouldn't come near us. I suspect in my later age, she must have been having a mental breakdown that lasted for 18 years. She really was a good person to friends and family, just not us. On with the story. One night, my sister and I were laying in bed, getting ready for sleep. We were about 11 years old. We heard heavy horse hooves on the roof of the house. Whatever was making this noise wanted us to know it was there, and it meant business. We huddled together. We had in our room a child-sized little red rocking chair. Besides the chair was a stack of notebook papers for school. That chair started rocking back and forth in a soothing manner. Then, one piece of paper rose into the air and it was crumpled into a ball and thrown at us on the bed. We were as tight as we could be in watching this happening. Then, the same thing happened again. All the while, the chair was rocking back and forth. Another piece of paper rose, crumpled, thrown. A big, hairy creature with horns tried to get in between us. My twin was paralyzed with fear. I was energized with fear. I ran to my dad's door, courageously running through the long, dark hallway, and banged with my fists on the door. My mom always kept their bedroom door locked. My dad came out like the Incredible Hulk to the rescue. He asked what was happening. I told him what I could, which wasn't much. I had a speech impediment, so I led him back to the room running and hoping he'd follow. He asked Billy what happened, who told him even more. Between the very short time that I'd left to get help, she told my dad. He had red eyes, horns with hair all over, and she was scared shitless. She wet the bed. And even though all this was happening, she still couldn't move, paralyzed with fear. I had a close friend we'll call Carmen. We lived close enough to one another that we could walk back and forth from her house to mine. My house was haunted. We lived close to a lake and went swimming every day with the exception of a few days in January and February. The home I lived in was initially a main cottage for a slew of smaller cottages back in the day, used as vacation cottages for people to get away and spend time with the family, fishing, swimming, etc. Meaning the main cottage was occupied full-time by the owners, whom rented the vacation ones. My living room was just off the newly built foyer my dad had built when he extended and remodeled the home. The furniture was a matching set. You may remember the style. Chairs and sofa had cushions that were an autumn camouflage with wooden flat dark stained lacquered armrests. You know what I'm talking about. Do any of you remember that style of furniture? Anyway, the living room was set up with the couch stationed on the right side of the foyer. Directly in front of the foyer was the chair I was sitting in doing homework. Carmen was sitting on the couch at the end near the lamp of the little table. We were using the flat armrests of the furniture as a desk. That's where we laid our paper to do our studies. Carmen began tapping her pencil on the wooden armrest. I was getting annoyed. I asked her, without looking up, to please stop. The pencil tap intensified with speed and weight. I was getting pissed. I looked right at her and said, "Stop it." That's when I noticed the sheer look of terror on her face. The pencil is in her hand, and it's out of control. She's looking at me and barely manages to say, "I'm not doing it." At this moment, the whole couch starts to... I don't know how to explain this. The way the pencil was chaotically tapping aggressively the armrest, the couch began doing the same to the floor, the whole couch. Carmen was paralyzed with fear. She was on the couch. I didn't think, I just did. I rushed out of my chair and jumped on the couch. This was a long time ago. I've no idea what I was trying to accomplish here. Maybe I thought I could weigh it down and make it stop, who knows? One good thing did happen though. When I jumped on the couch, it gave Carmen the courage to run as fast as she could out of the house, leaving me there alone, on that couch. As I followed her escape with my eyes, I saw an apparition by the lamp in detail. The colour was an iridescent greenish hue. I saw a man in a Civil War uniform. He was wearing a hat with the Confederate cross. He was looking right at me. After looking at him and he at me for what seemed to be an eternity, everything stopped. He disappeared. I told my parents what happened. My mom had some choice words for me, and my dad said, "Enough, it's late, bedtime." My grandma used to have my bedroom where she died. A few days later, I was cleaning out the closet and found a picture. An old black and white picture with maybe 8 or 9 people in it, all in uniform. I recognized one of them. Yeah, the apparition, in perfect detail. I showed my mum the picture and asked her who it was. She said she didn't know. We live in a 1940s bungalow in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Been in the same house 15 years, and it's only recently we've started to experience possible paranormal activities. I guess it kicked off in April of this year, when my father and I did a full remodel of the downstairs bathroom. My daughter, 16, woke up one morning with scratches all over her cheeks, going in crisscross patterns, and sometimes you could make out sets of 3. They were finer than a cat scratch, and we don't have a cat. My daughter bites her nails down to the nub. There's literally nothing sharp about them. Plus, these scratches were really close together. Fingers would be too far apart to make these marks. She doesn't have a down feather pillow or blanket. She sleeps with our terrier, whose nails are too bulky and dull to be the culprit. If it were a rodent or something, firstly, I think she'd wake up. Secondly, I think the dog would have prevented that. She came to show me. We took pictures. Everyone agreed that was weird, and we put it to the back of our mind. Nothing else physical happened for weeks, but she was complaining of waking up a lot, nightmares, and even sleep paralysis. My husband and I were getting alerts from the camera in the living room every night. Around 3, there would be knocking. Maybe in sets of 3, I can't really recall. But the camera detects sound and sent alerts. We couldn't find the source or even a general location for that matter. It's an old house, so we just kind of shrugged it off and didn't think much about it. It eventually tapered off and we forgot it was even happening. Until a few Sundays ago, when my daughter and I are baking my dad a birthday cake. He just took her shower and is helping out in the kitchen. Wearing shorts, she said, "I'm cold, gonna put pants on." Walks from the kitchen to her room, puts sweats on, and comes running back into the kitchen, freaked out. She pulls up her pant leg and her calf is shredded. Some are deep enough to draw blood, but the scratches are back. To be honest, I freaked out too. She was gone for less than 30 seconds. She said she didn't see them on her leg while drying off and only felt them as she was pulling her sweats up. She felt a burning. So maybe I'm in the wrong place. But if anyone has advice on what to do or been through something similar, I'd love some help. I apologise if this is the wrong sub. We are interested in paranormal stuff, but don't go as far as to play around with the things, like the Ouija board or dabble. So it's not like we opened a doorway. That's why I think it's the remodel. When I was in college, I worked at a sports bar in Colorado. Before I was able to become a waitress, I had to be a hostess for a month. One Saturday, we got pretty busy because there was a local baseball game happening. I was sitting people pretty frequently throughout the afternoon. Toward the end of the lunch rush, a couple people came into the restaurant. I remember commenting on the woman's large turquoise necklace, telling her how pretty it was as I showed them to a table on the back patio, having some useless and polite conversation with them the whole time. I went and got the waters and brought them to the table, told them their server would be with them shortly, then returned to the host stand. About 5 minutes later, the same couple walked into the restaurant and toward the host stand. I was very confused and asked if they needed to be reseated. The lady looked at me seemingly just as confused as I was and noticed her large turquoise necklace again. The man said 2, please, and I instinctively grabbed 2 menus and told them to follow me, thinking someone was playing a joke on me. I turned to the corner to get a view out of the back patio, where I sat the couple originally, and saw that the table was empty. Per the couple's request to sit outside again, I led them to the patio and noticed 2 waters and 2 menus sitting on the table already. I didn't know what to do, so I picked everything up and told them I would get them some new waters. I made my way to the bar to get waters, and the waitress from the back patio section came up and asked if I was okay. She said that 5 minutes earlier, she saw me walk to the patio holding 2 menus, as if I was seating people, but there was nobody there. Then I came back with waters and put them down as if I was talking to people, but the seats were still empty. She said she was on her way to come check on me, because her and other guests on the back porch were concerned about what I was doing, talking to nobody. I asked if there were people there now, and she looked confused and said yes. So from what I can gather, I saw, talked to, and sat these two people before they actually came into the restaurant. I have no explanation for this, and I'm wondering if anyone else has ever had an experience like this. Just to preface, my grandmother grew up poor and always wanted a doll and never had one. Even in her old age, she would sadly recall how she never had one. So my uncle surprised her for her 60th birthday with a baby doll. She loved it, and I could see as if she was a child again. She would hug it often, but she kept it in the china cabinet to keep it in good shape. Fast forward to 20 years later, Grandma was 80, and I was grown up with a 2-year-old daughter. She was giving signs that she would die soon. She was healthy, but kept hinting she wouldn't be around much longer. A week before she passed, she wanted to give my daughter her doll. I told her no because Grandma was always very generous, but I felt like she was giving up on life. I told her to take it back and that she would live much longer. When she passed suddenly the following week, I saw that doll on her nightstand. I almost screamed when I saw it. There was something very odd about it. It's like it changed somehow, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The doll never scared me before. My mom told me it was Grandma's wish that I gave it to my daughter. Ignoring all the creepiness I felt, I agreed and took it home. The doll itself never did anything strange, but I felt like it was watching me somehow. I couldn't ignore the feeling, but I told myself I was foolish. I intended on keeping it forever, no matter what my feelings were. My daughter never really played with it. I'd see it on the floor and I'd be afraid of picking it up. I put it in the spare bedroom and at times was afraid to walk past the room. 3 years of this. My sister came over one day. We were upstairs and I saw her walk into the spare room. She suddenly runs out, looking pale-faced. She says to me, "That doll gives me the creeps. Get rid of it." I suddenly felt that I wasn't alone in my feelings and told her everything I was feeling. But I felt I was letting Grandma down by getting rid of it. After talking more, we agreed that I would donate it. I put it in a bag. I was so frightened of it, I put the bag away from my body, as if a snake were in there. And this is the strangest feeling I ever had, but I felt like the doll was crying because I was getting rid of it. But I wasn't going to let it manipulate me. I still feel sad that I got rid of it. I try not to feel guilty that I somehow let Grandma down. I don't know what happened and why I had those feelings. This took place when I was 12 in the early 90s. I have no explanation for what I saw. My parents were invited to have coffee at the home of some friends. My sister, 11, and I came along. The couple had 2 children our age, whom we knew since we were babies. They had a finished basement that had a kitchen and a sitting area. So the grown-ups, we're having a fun conversation down there. Us kids got bored after a while. This was before computers, iPads, etc., and it was already dark outside. My sister Dee said, "Let's play hide and seek." Our friend Sarah had a younger sister who was 6, so we were trying to find something fun for her to do as well. So Sarah started counting to 50 downstairs in the living room. My sister, Sarah's sister, and I headed upstairs towards the bedrooms, hoping to find a good hiding spot. We went into their parents' bedroom and hid between the bed, while we faced the door. We were planning to duck and hide ourselves once Sarah came up the stairs. The room was pitch dark, except for the streetlight that was directly outside. The light casted a shadow on the wall in front of us. That's when I saw an unusual shadow on the wall. The shadow resembled a black pistol. I said to the 2 girls with me, "Do you see that weird shadow?" I looked around, but I couldn't find anything in the room that would make that shape. I walked up to it. The shadow started to slowly move backwards into an open closet. It was no longer a shadow, but now looked like a black pistol pointed at us, but moved backwards into the closet. I got the impression right away that it didn't want to be discovered and was trying to hide. I saw it move forcefully backwards into some clothes. When it did this, the clothes moved violently as the things hid. I asked, "Did you see that?" And both girls whispered yes. I almost had the nerve to go in and move everything to find it, but suddenly got creeped out and we ran downstairs. We didn't even care that Sarah never found us, but we announced that we didn't want to play anymore. We went from energetic kids to very quiet for the rest of the stay. We didn't say anything to anyone, but I told my parents a year after because it always bothered me. It felt evil and if it had some intelligence. I've always wondered if that family ever saw it or if they had other experiences, but I've never heard anything about it. I don't know why we saw it, what it was doing there, and why it was shaped like a pistol. I was invited to their house when I was around 20. Sarah was getting married. Her mother wanted to show us the dress she bought for the wedding, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to that bedroom, so I stayed downstairs. This happened to me 2 months ago. It's not necessarily scary, just strange to me. My dad passed 3 years ago. My mom, sister and I lived blocks from one another. When he passed, my sister and I would visit mom on weekends when we weren't working. We'd keep her busy since she was recently widowed. My sister took his death harder than anyone. She had guilt that their relationship wasn't the best because of her own stubbornness. As part of her therapy, she had to come to terms with it, so I'd help her with that. Father was buried at a cemetery only 15 minutes away. We'd visit him every weekend unless something came up. I admit that I hate cemeteries. They're sad places and creep me out. He's buried in an outdoor mausoleum that faces a pond. We joke that he upgraded to a condo near the lake, so it wasn't that bad. Visiting every weekend sounds like a lot, but we wanted my sister to get over her guilt and depression. After a while, it didn't bother me. The last time we visited on one beautiful sunny day, we stood just looking at his grave and the ones nearby. I suddenly felt cold, despite it being 80 degrees. I felt goosebumps, like I became very uncomfortable. I looked to my right at my mom and sis. Both have the same expression as I do. I said, "Let's get out of here." Mom says, "Yeah, I'm getting the creeps." We leave right away. My sister goes as far to say, "I don't want to come back here again." We all agree and haven't been back. So I don't know what happened that day. It was just a feeling, but I'm not the only one who felt it.